Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The 11:47 shift. The digital clock on the microwave stubbornly displayed 11:47 p.m. It had been stuck on that time for the past 3 hours, ever since I, Daniel Dan O'Connell, started my overnight shift at the Meridian Plaza. I'm IT support, usually relegated to daytime calls, password resets, and the occasional server hiccup. But tonight, they needed someone to oversee a crucial system upgrade, a task that required me to be physically present in the server room, a cold, sterile space on the 37th floor. I should have been home hours ago, curled up with a good book and a cup of tea. Instead, I was trapped in a malfunctioning elevator, suspended between the 32nd and 33rd floors, watching the floor indicator display numbers that couldn't exist. 54, 67, 83. The elevator lurched, not up or down, but sideways, a physical impossibility that sent a wave of nausea through me. I pressed the emergency call button repeatedly, but it was useless. No alarm, no response, just a dead silence that was somehow more terrifying than any alarm bell. I'm not a superstitious man. I believe in logic, in reason, in the tangible and explainable. But this defied all logic. The doors finally opened, revealing not the 33rd floor, not any floor I recognized, but a scene seemingly ripped from a 1980s office drama. The carpet was a hideous brown shag. The desks were bulky metal monstrosities, and the air was thick with the stale scent of cigarette smoke. A woman with impossibly large hair and shoulder pads that could rival a linebacker's sat typing at a massive computer, its screen displaying green text on a black background. She looked blurry, somehow like a photograph out of focus. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the unfamiliar space. "Can you help me?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even turn around. She just kept typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The elevator doors began to close. I instinctively jumped back inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The floor indicator now displayed 12B. 12B? Our building didn't have a 12B. The elevator moved again, this time accompanied by a grinding, metallic screech that set my teeth on edge. I frantically pressed the button for the lobby, for any floor, for reality, but nothing happened. The display changed to 19X. When the doors opened again, I saw what looked like my office, the familiar layout of cubicles and desks, but altered. Dead plants littered the floor, dust covered every surface, and papers were scattered everywhere, as if a hurricane had swept through. And through the windows I saw ruins, a cityscape of shattered buildings and a sky stained a sickly crimson red. A shuffling sound came from down the hall, growing closer. I didn't wait to see what was making it. I slammed the close door button with a force that made my hand sting. The doors closed just as something rounded the corner. Something that moved like a human but wasn't shaped quite right. Its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. The elevator ascended, the display now showing a series of symbols I didn't recognize. Glyphs, perhaps, or some kind of alien script. The next stop presented a scene of bizarre familiarity. It was my office, exactly as I had left it yesterday. I saw myself, sitting at my desk, hunched over my laptop, clearly working late. I stepped out of the elevator, a desperate hope surging through me. Maybe this was a way back, a chance to reset, to undo whatever madness was happening. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the quiet office. "Hey you! Me! Can you hear me?" The other me didn't react. He didn't even look up. He just continued typing, oblivious to my presence. I watched, mesmerized, as my past self checked his watch, sighed, and began packing up his belongings. He grabbed his jacket, slung his bag over his shoulder, and headed towards the elevator. This was the night before the system upgrade, the night before this whole nightmare began. "Wait!" I cried, lunging forward. "Don't get in that elevator." But my words were swallowed by the silence. My past self walked right past me, our shoulders brushing as he entered the elevator. A jolt of intense pain shot through my head, a blinding flash of white light that made me stumble backward. I fell back into the elevator, dizzy and disoriented. When I could see again, my past self was gone. The elevator doors were closing. The display showed Omega. The next floor opened onto a vast, cavernous space filled with rows upon rows of server racks, stretching as far as the eye could see. Red warning lights blinked silently, casting an eerie glow over the scene. The air was thick with a strange, metallic tang, and a low hum vibrated through the floor. This wasn't our server room. It was something else, something far grander, far more alien. And then I saw it. The servers were melting, not burning, not exploding, but melting, like wax candles under intense heat. The metal frames were contorting, dripping onto the floor, forming pools of molten slag. I slammed the closed door button repeatedly, a frantic, desperate plea. The doors finally obeyed, sealing me off from the horrifying spectacle. My phone, which had been stubbornly dead for the past hour, suddenly vibrated. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. The screen displayed the time, 11:47 p.m. It hadn't changed since this whole ordeal began. I tried calling security, the emergency number, anyone, but there was no signal. Just a blank screen and the mocking, unchanging time, 11:47 p.m. The elevator stopped again. The doors opened, and I found myself staring at a scene of underwater devastation. It was the Meridian Plaza lobby, recognizable yet utterly transformed. Water filled the space, reaching almost to the ceiling. Fish, small and silver, darted past the security desk, where seaweed now swayed in place of potted plants. The water was murky, obscuring the details, but I could make out the outlines of submerged furniture, overturned desks, and floating debris. The elevator doors remained open, the water lapping at the threshold, but strangely, not flowing inside. It was as if an invisible barrier held it back. I could see movement in the distance, something large and sinuous, with too many fins, gliding through the submerged lobby. I didn't want to know what it was. Floor after floor, the elevator presented me with a series of increasingly bizarre and terrifying visions. Our office during what looked like a World War II bombing raid, with sandbags piled against the windows and propaganda posters plastered on the walls. Our office transformed into a lush, overgrown jungle, with trees growing through the ceiling and vines snaking across the desks. Our office as a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, numbered markers indicating what? Bodies? Evidence? I couldn't bring myself to look closer. Each time, the elevator doors would open, revealing a new, impossible scenario. Each time, I would frantically press the close door button, desperate to escape the horrifying visions. And each time, my watch remained stubbornly fixed at 11:47 p.m. My phone remained dead, a useless brick in my pocket. I had lost track of how many floors I had seen, how many times the elevator had lurched and groaned and shifted in impossible directions. Time had ceased to have any meaning. Then, the elevator stopped again. The doors opened, and I saw my office, exactly as it should be. Empty, quiet, the computers humming softly, the city lights twinkling outside the windows. On my desk, a cup of coffee steamed gently. My jacket hung on the back of my chair. My laptop screen displayed a single line of text. Timeline divergence detected. Attempting to reconcile, I stepped out of the elevator, my legs shaky, my heart pounding. Could it be over? Had I somehow returned to my own reality? I approached my desk cautiously, my eyes fixed on the laptop screen. The coffee cup was mine. I recognized the small chip on the handle. The coffee was still warm. The text on the screen changed. Multiple instances detected. Initiating emergency protocol. Suddenly, the building's fire alarm blared to life. A deafening, ear-splitting shriek that made me jump. Red emergency lights began to flash, casting a strobe-like effect across the office. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. I had to get out. I ran towards the elevator, but the doors were already closing. The floor indicator displayed error in flashing red letters. I pressed the call button repeatedly, frantically, but nothing happened. The elevator was unresponsive. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps approaching from the stairwell. The door handle began to turn. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. I dove inside just as something entered the office, something tall and dark, its movements jerky and unnatural like a stop-motion animation figure. The elevator plunged downwards, faster than I thought possible, the cables screaming in protest. The floor indicator flashed a chaotic jumble of numbers and symbols, a meaningless kaleidoscope of light. My stomach lurched, my head spun. I felt like I was falling, then everything stopped. The doors opened, and I saw myself, standing in the elevator, at 11:47 p.m., just beginning this whole nightmarish journey. My past self looked tired, stressed, ready to go home after a long day of dealing with server issues. He hadn't yet noticed anything wrong, hadn't yet experienced the terror of the shifting floors, the impossible realities. He was about to press the button for the lobby. I wanted to scream, to warn him, to tell him to take the stairs, to go anywhere but into that elevator. But no sound came out. I was a ghost, an observer trapped in a loop of my own making. My past self pressed the button. The doors began to close. Our eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that moment, I saw the dawning horror in his eyes, the realization that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Then the doors slammed shut, sealing him in, sending him on the same terrifying journey I had just endured. The elevator shook violently, the floor indicator displaying every number, every symbol, every impossible floor I had seen, cycling faster and faster, a dizzying blur of light and sound. Then silence. The doors opened. I was in the lobby, the real lobby. The night security guard, a young man named Kevin, looked up from his desk, his expression startled. "Everything okay, Mr. O'Connell?" he asked. "Thought I heard the elevator acting up." I stepped out of the elevator, my legs feeling like jelly, my body trembling uncontrollably. My watch showed 11:48 p.m. My phone came back to life, buzzing with a flurry of delayed notifications. "Fine," I managed to say, my voice hoarse and unsteady. "Everything's fine." I walked out of the building, into the cool night air, my mind reeling. I didn't look back. I drove home, taking the long way around, avoiding any tall buildings. When I got to my apartment, I took the stairs all 15 flights, my lungs burning, my legs aching. The next day, I went back to work. Everything was normal. The server upgrade had been successful. No one else seemed to notice anything strange. But I knew. I knew what happened at 11:47 p.m. in tall buildings. I knew about the wrong floors, the shifting realities, the impossible spaces that existed outside of normal time and space. I started taking the stairs every day, all 27 flights to my office. I told people it was for the exercise. But last week, I saw something. Just for a moment, through the stairwell window, I saw that crimson sky again, the ruined cityscape. And now, when I check my phone late at night, it sometimes, just sometimes, displays 11:47 p.m., no matter what the actual time is. I've started looking for a new job, something on the ground floor, something far away from elevators and shifting realities. Because I know that somewhere, in some version of that elevator, I'm still riding, still trapped, still trying to find my way back to the right timeline. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I ever really left. The butcher's secret. 2 years prior, my wife, Amelia, and I purchased a small lakeside property, a summer retreat to escape the relentless pace of city life. As soon as our 5-year-old son, Oliver, finished kindergarten, we packed our belongings and set off for our new vacation home. Amelia, a successful biologist, was fortunate to have a job that allowed her to work remotely, conducting research from our lakeside property. Our family was blessed by her career, affording us a comfortable lifestyle. However, it also meant frequent relocations over the past decade or so, making it challenging for me to maintain consistent employment. This new town had a single, small grocery store, seemingly the central hub for both locals and the influx of tourists that arrived with the warmer weather. Fortunately, my background as a trained butcher, honed from jobs in my early 20s, made finding work relatively straightforward. I applied for a position at this small store and was hired almost immediately. There were 2 butchers on staff, myself and the store's owner/manager, a man named Walter. For the first few weeks, Walter seemed like a fairly quiet, laid-back individual. He never seemed to mind that I was usually about 5 minutes late for my 7 a.m. start time. Physically, he was a striking figure, about 6 feet tall with greasy black hair and a prominent nose. He had small, green, beady eyes, and his voice was deep and resonant, rumbling slightly when he spoke. His teeth were unusually small, almost childlike, giving him a slightly unsettling smile that revealed a jumble of teeth. It was after those initial few weeks that things started to take a turn. Walter's temper became increasingly volatile. He would explode at me over seemingly minor issues, his anger erupting without warning. Then, just as quickly, he'd revert to his calm demeanor, as if nothing had happened. At first, I dismissed it as a quirk, a personality flaw. I'd encountered plenty of intense, eccentric butchers in my career, and I figured Walter was just another one of them. I'm not one to judge, but the outbursts became more frequent, more unsettling. He started making veiled threats, saying things like, "You better get this done when I leave, or you'll be sorry," or mumbling under his breath, "Sometimes I think you'd be more helpful to me if you were dead." The comments made me uncomfortable, but I still tried to rationalize his behavior, attributing it to some ingrained management style, a harsh approach learned from years in the business. Then came the day I arrived 15 minutes late. I'd been caught in an unexpected traffic jam, and, unfortunately, there were no alternative routes to the store. I walked in to find Walter standing in the meat cooler, staring at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. He was wearing a black apron, splattered with blood from the morning's butchering, and he still held a large butcher knife in his hand. I tried to apologize, but before I could utter a word, he raised his hand, silencing me. His deep voice, usually resonant, now carried a chilling edge. "This will be the last time you're late," he said, his gaze unwavering. "The last person to disrespect me." He paused, his eyes dropping to the floor for a moment, then finished, "Never mind, just don't be late again." The next few days, he was unusually quiet, as if something were weighing heavily on his mind. To me, it was a welcome reprieve from his constant complaints. One day, he left early, instructing me to cut a few extra items and clean the meat room. It was around 7 p.m., and I was about to call it a night and head home when I noticed something peculiar in the back corner of the meat cooler. We had what we called bone cans, large waste receptacles for disposing of bones and trimmed fat. From underneath one of these cans, I saw a small pool of blood. Normally, this wouldn't be a cause for alarm. It was a common occurrence in a butcher shop. But this blood looked fresh, and the smell emanating from the can was absolutely horrific. I tried to move the can, but it was unusually heavy. They were typically emptied once a week, but this week, the pickup had been delayed for some reason. I cautiously removed the lid, and the stench that hit me was so overpowering, I almost passed out. And then I saw it. Meat, but it wasn't the usual scraps and trimmings. This meat had a strange color, and there was far more blood than usual. I quickly replaced the lid, my mind reeling, trying to comprehend what I'd just seen. I'd been in this business for a long time, and I'd encountered spoiled meat before, but this was different. This was something far more unsettling. The next day, I arrived at work to find Walter standing in the cooler. Again, he looked furious. He approached me, his eyes blazing, the knife still in his hand. "What do you think you saw in that can?" he demanded. his voice rising with each word. He started poking my chest with his finger, his tone becoming increasingly hostile and defensive. "Come on, pal. Tell me what you saw. I know you were digging. Just tell me what you think you saw." His voice escalated into a yell, and that's when I decided I'd had enough. The moment he put his hands on me, I was done. The baffling part was, how did he even know I'd looked in the bone can? Had I left the lid ajar? Couldn't remember. I turned and walked out, and he actually followed me to my car, not to apologize, but to continue his harangue about the bone can. I drove off, glancing in my rearview mirror, and saw him standing in the parking lot, still yelling at me. The truth was, I hadn't actually dug in the can. I'd only looked inside for a few seconds. I drove straight home, and Amelia, understandably, was supportive, encouraging me to take the rest of the summer off and spend time with Oliver. About a week after I quit, I was awakened in my recliner, in the living room around 4 o'clock or 5 a.m. I was startled by lights outside, a vehicle driving past the property. Amelia had already left for the day, and Oliver was still asleep. I made my way to the window, all the lights in the house off. There, parked outside my house, was a massive red pickup truck. The scary part? There was nobody inside, and though I couldn't make out all the details, the truck looked strikingly similar to the one that was always parked outside the grocery store Walter's truck. I went into Oliver's room and stayed there, awake, for the rest of the night. Around 7:30 a.m., I looked outside, and the truck was gone. For the next few nights, I saw that same truck driving around the block, but I could never get a clear view of the driver. I told Amelia about my suspicions, and she suggested that we return to our house in the city, as her current research project was nearing completion. A few weeks after we'd moved back to the city, I needed to return to the lake house to retrieve some items we'd left behind. When I arrived, I found one of our windows broken and the interior of the house ransacked, as if someone had been searching for something. I reported the incident to the local authorities, primarily to document the damage for insurance purposes. I have no concrete proof that Walter was responsible for the break-in, or that my family was ever in any real danger. But something about that man, about his volatile behavior, his unsettling comments, and that mysterious bone can, left me deeply disturbed. I think next year we are planning on selling the property. The figure in the dress. This story takes place during my high school years, a time of late-night hangouts and youthful adventures, often tinged with a healthy dose of teenage recklessness. A couple of friends and I were returning home late one summer weekend night from another friend's house. I was around 15 at the time. We'd been having a small get-together at our friend Cameron's house. It was a low-key affair, just me, my older brother Ethan, Cameron's girlfriend, Olivia, and my best friend.
Ilaela Cal Jasper.
The evening was filled with the usual teenage pastimes. Video games, card games, watching absurd comedy shows like The Eric Andre Show, and, for everyone but me, a fair amount of drinking and smoking. I was the odd one out, abstaining from both substances. As the night wore on, approaching 2:30 a.m., Jasper and I decided it was time to head home. Ethan, significantly more intoxicated, opted to stay at Cameron's, sleeping off the effects of the evening's revelry. Cameron lived about a 30-minute walk from Jasper's house, and while it was on the same main road, it was a considerable distance for two sleep-deprived 15-year-olds, one of whom was still buzzing from sugary drinks and candy. For context, we frequently visited Cameron's on weekends, so we were quite accustomed to the 30-minute walk. To shorten the journey, we often cut through the city park, which was also conveniently located along the same road. During the day, the park was a picturesque oasis, with lush greenery, weeping willow trees, and a meandering river. It was a popular spot for picnics and leisurely strolls. At night, however, the park transformed into a different entity altogether. It was almost entirely devoid of light, save for a few sparsely placed, dimly lit street lamps. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of traffic. It was a place that, while beautiful by day, held an unsettling aura after dark. While I have many stories about that park, This particular tale focuses on what we encountered just after we exited the park's boundaries. As we left the park, Jasper and I decided to grab some snacks for the remainder of our walk. We stopped at a nearby gas station, its bright fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the darkness we'd just emerged from. The young woman at the counter, likely assessing our slightly disheveled, possibly stoned-looking appearance, asked me to leave my backpack at the door. I complied, and we quickly gathered our snacks and proceeded to pay. As we thanked the cashier and stepped back out into the night, we noticed that a strong windstorm had picked up, blowing fiercely against us as we started down the long road leading to Jasper's house. It was at this point that I first began to feel uneasy. It was a strange, almost imperceptible sensation, a faint whisper of warning in the back of my mind. Jasper, still slurping down his drink and slightly under the influence, hadn't initially noticed the change in atmosphere. He was still somewhat oblivious to the strong wind swirling around us. We walked for several minutes, the wind howling, until we came upon that house. It was set far back from the sidewalk, behind a sprawling, overgrown front yard. The house itself was dilapidated, completely deserted, with all its windows shattered, and a yard so neglected that the tall grass nearly obscured the front door. I glanced at the house, my unease growing. The sidewalk in front of it was cracked, uneven, and littered with trash and weeds. The wind continued to howl, causing the wooden shutters of the house to slam rhythmically against the window sills, creating a creepy, clattering sound, a creak followed by a loud bang. Now, I know this sounds like a cliché, straight out of a Hollywood horror movie. The dilapidated house, the broken shutters, the howling wind. But what made this house so unsettling was its sheer incongruity. The surrounding neighborhood consisted of well-maintained suburban homes and townhouses, all neatly arranged, their driveways abutting the main road. But this house was an anomaly, set far back from the street, looking small and isolated within its vast, neglected yard. While the house itself wasn't the scariest thing I've ever encountered, it was a contributing factor, a piece of the puzzle that heightened my sense of dread for what was to come. Just a few short blocks ahead, we passed the house. Jasper, now starting to sober up and feeling the discomfort of the wind and the long walk ahead, began to share my unease. At this point, we were only about 10 minutes away from Jasper's house, and that's when we saw it, the most bizarre, inexplicable, and terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. In the distance, just far enough away that details were obscured, we saw a very skinny man crossing the road. He appeared to be wearing some sort of women's sleeveless dress or blouse, revealing only his gaunt arms and head, the garment covering his legs. He was unusually tall, and his movements were strange. It almost looked as if he were hovering across the street, gliding rather than walking. Jasper and I immediately stopped in our tracks, our fear escalating. We hadn't seen any cars pass by, nor had we encountered any other pedestrians since leaving Cameron's house. The streets were utterly deserted. We watched, frozen in place, as the man slowly moved from one side of the street to the other. He entered a small parking lot belonging to a business building and didn't reappear. We seized this opportunity to speed walk down the street, our pace quickening as we approached Jasper's house. We reached the house, our fear still palpable. The house was shrouded in complete darkness. The power had apparently gone out, likely due to the strong wind. Adding to the unsettling atmosphere, we could hear 3-car alarms wailing somewhere nearby. It was at this moment that my stomach dropped. "Jasper," I exclaimed. I left my backpack at the gas station. A wave of gut-wrenching dread washed over me. Jasper looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. Neither of us wanted to go back, but the prospect of venturing into the pitch-black house was equally unappealing. So, we made the agonizing decision to turn around and run back to retrieve my backpack, which contained most of my belongings, including a PlayStation 3 I'd brought over to Cameron's. By this point, the wind was violent, whipping around us with ferocious intensity. We didn't see the mysterious figure reappear initially, a small blessing in an otherwise terrifying situation. But it wouldn't last. As we neared the gas station, we came across that damn house again. And, I kid you not, the moment we passed it, the wind abruptly stopped. It was dead silent, just like that, and I could feel that same uneasy, dreadful feeling wash over me, a suffocating wave of apprehension. Something in my gut screamed, "Don't look at the house. Don't look at the house." Just as we were almost past it, my heart stopped. I heard the wind suddenly slam shut the front door of the house, a loud, resounding bang that echoed in the sudden silence. We started sprinting towards the gas station, our fear reaching a fever pitch. I ran inside, the young woman at the counter looking at us with a mixture of curiosity and mild alarm, unfazed by our panicked appearance. I told her I'd forgotten my bag. By this time, it was approaching 4 a.m. We were exhausted, desperate to get home and find some semblance of safety. Jasper asked the lady if she could give us a ride, explaining that we'd seen someone following us, but she refused. "I can't leave the counter unattended." "I'm sorry," she said. She could clearly see that we were shaken, and she asked if we needed her to call the police. When she said that, reality started to set in. We began to calm down, our rational minds slowly regaining control. Jasper politely declined her offer, saying that we'd be all right. We stepped outside and checked the time on our phones. We tried to talk ourselves out of what had just happened, attempting to rationalize the encounter, to chalk it up to our overactive imaginations, fueled by fatigue and the late hour. We told ourselves that the man crossing the road was probably just some eccentric individual, perhaps lost or mentally unstable. The road was known as a hotspot for unusual characters, a thoroughfare connecting the downtown area to the outskirts of the city. We managed to calm ourselves down, and we started heading back, still jogging, eager to reach the safety of Jasper's house and get some rest before sunrise. And this is where it gets truly terrifying. We ran past the house, this time on the opposite side of the road, without incident. But then the man reappeared. This time he wasn't far behind us. He seemed to be speedwalking, moving directly towards us in the middle of the road. But his movements were still unnatural, almost ethereal. It was as if he were gliding, his body barely moving, only his dress rippling in the wind. We started to run full sprint, and the man followed. He seemed to disappear for a few blocks, only to reappear behind us again, a relentless, ghostly pursuer. We finally reached Jasper's house, the power still out. We sprinted through the front door, our fear reaching its peak. I could hear his footsteps scraping on the ground outside, the sound of sandals against the pavement. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder as we slammed the door shut. He was no longer pursuing us. A wave of relief washed over me, a shaky, fragile sense of safety. We locked the door, shut off all the lights, and closed the blinds. We lit a candle in the kitchen, too scared to even attempt sleep. We looked at each other and, in a moment of shared hysteria, burst into laughter. The sheer absurdity of what had just happened, the terror we'd experienced, the image of that strange man lurking in a dress at 3 a.m. in the middle of the suburbs. It was all so bizarre, so overwhelming that laughter was the only release. We managed to get some sleep eventually, and we recounted the entire ordeal to Cameron the next day. It was such a weird, unexplainable experience that, to this day, I still question what I witnessed. Was that man a real person or something else? His movements, his attire, the way he seemed to appear and disappear, it all felt so surreal, so supernatural, that I sometimes wonder if I was the only one who truly saw what was happening. Either way, I hope I never encounter that man in the dress, wandering the streets at 3 a.m. ever again. It's a memory that continues to haunt me, a chilling reminder of the unseen, the unexplained, that can lurk in the shadows of the ordinary, the collector of lost calls. The first call arrived at precisely 2 a.m. I remember it clearly because it was my first solo night shift at Answer All, a 24/7 customer service center providing support for a dozen different companies. I, Eleanor Vance, was the newest recruit, fresh out of training and eager to prove myself. The caller ID displayed unknown number. That wasn't unusual. Many callers blocked their numbers, but the voice on the other end, That was something I'll never forget. It was a woman's voice, elderly and frail, laced with a tremor of what sounded like grief. Eleanor Vance, the voice said, my full name, a chill instantly prickling my skin. Born July 12, 1995 at Mercy Hospital. You have a small scar above your left eyebrow from when you fell off your swing set at age 6. My breath caught in my throat. How could she know that? Nobody at work knew those details. I'd only just moved to this city. Ma'am, I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. How can I help you today? I was following the script, trying to maintain a professional demeanor, but my heart was pounding. The voice continued, ignoring my question. Your mother, Carol Vance, died of a brain aneurysm on March 8, 2007. You were 11. You found her in the kitchen, slumped over the breakfast table. You still have nightmares about it. Tears welled up in my eyes. The details were excruciatingly accurate, painfully personal. This wasn't a prank call. This was something else. Who are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible. How do you know these things? You have a fear of spiders, the voice continued, relentless in its recitation of my personal history. You sleep with a stuffed elephant named Humphrey, even though you're 28 years old. You secretly resent your father for remarrying so soon after your mother's death. Each detail, each secret, each hidden truth felt like a violation. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Stop it, I pleaded. Please, just stop. Your sister, Olivia, didn't really have a miscarriage last year, the voice said, the tone shifting, becoming colder, more accusatory. She had an abortion. She told you she couldn't handle another child. But the truth is, she was afraid. Afraid of repeating your mother's mistakes. Afraid of becoming her. The words hit me like a physical blow. Olivia had confided in me, sworn me to secrecy. How could this stranger, this disembodied voice, know such a deeply personal, deeply painful secret? What do you want? I demanded, my voice rising in panic. Why are you doing this? You're lonely, Eleanor, the voice said, the tone softening slightly, almost sympathetic. You push people away. You build walls. You hide behind your work, behind your routines. You're afraid of getting hurt again. I wanted to hang up, to disconnect the call, to erase the voice from my memory. But I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped, compelled to listen. You have $1,247 in your bank account, the voice continued. Your rent is due next week, and you're short $300. You're thinking about asking your father for help, but you're too proud, too ashamed. The accuracy was terrifying. I had checked my bank balance just hours before. The numbers burned into my memory. You shoplift small items, the voice said, the tone now almost whispery. Lipstick, magazines, candy bars. You don't need them. You just like the thrill. It makes you feel alive. My face flushed with shame. It was true. I had a secret, shameful habit of taking small, insignificant items, a compulsion I couldn't explain, a darkness I kept hidden from everyone. Your boyfriend, Mark, is cheating on you, the voice said, the words delivered with a chilling matter-of-factness. With his colleague, Jessica. They meet at the Starlight Motel on Elm Street every Wednesday afternoon. My stomach churned. Mark had been distant lately, working late, canceling plans. I had attributed it to stress at work. But now doubt, suspicion, and a sickening sense of betrayal washed over me. You killed a bird when you were 8, the voice continued, relentless in its unveiling of my buried secrets. You threw a rock, not intending to hit it, but it fell from the sky, its wing broken. You buried it in the backyard under the oak tree. You never told anyone. Tears streamed down my face, silent sobs racking my body. These were things I had locked away, things I had tried to forget, things I had never spoken aloud to another soul. Who are you? I pleaded, my voice broken. Please, tell me who you are. You have a birthmark on your hip, shaped like a crescent moon, the voice said, ignoring my question. You're afraid of the dark. You still check under your bed before you go to sleep. You! Stop! I screamed, finally finding my voice. Just stop. What do you want from me? A long silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of the office equipment and my own ragged breathing. Then, the voice spoke again, softer this time, almost sad. You're going to die soon, Eleanor. Very soon. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? The pain in your chest. It's not indigestion. The headaches. They're not from stress. You should have seen a doctor months ago, but you didn't. You were afraid of what they might find. It was true. I had been experiencing chest pains, sharp, stabbing pains that radiated down my left arm. I had dismissed them as anxiety, as heartburn, as anything but what they truly were. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice trembling. Because someone has to, the voice replied. Because you need to know. Because the truth always comes out, eventually. But who are you? A faint chuckle, dry and humorless, echoed through the phone. Look at your computer screen, Eleanor. I glanced at my monitor. The call log showed unknown number, as it had before, but the time was wrong. It showed 3:33 a.m. Impossible. It had been 2 a.m. just moments ago. I checked my phone. No active call. No record of any incoming calls in the past hour. I stood up, my legs weak and unsteady. The office was empty. The other operators had gone home. The supervisor's office was dark. My chest tightened. A sharp, searing pain ripped through my left arm. I stumbled, clutching at my chest, gasping for air. I tried to call for help, but my fingers were numb, unresponsive. I couldn't dial. The pain intensified, spreading like wildfire through my chest. I could feel my heart pounding erratically, struggling to beat. The room began to spin. I collapsed to the floor, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw was my computer screen, the time display changing. 3:34 a.m. Then darkness. I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by the sterile white walls and the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment. A doctor, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, was standing beside me, checking my vitals. You're very lucky, Ms. Vance, she said, her voice soft but firm. You had a major heart attack. If the cleaning crew hadn't found you when they did, you wouldn't have made it. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and scratchy. The doctor offered me a cup of water with a straw. I had a call. I managed to say, my voice hoarse. A woman. She knew things. The doctor frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. You were probably hallucinating, Eleanor. It's common after a traumatic event like this. We'll run some tests, but I suspect it was just a side effect of the medication. But I knew it wasn't a hallucination. I knew the voice, the details, the chilling predictions. They were all real. I spent 3 days in the hospital, undergoing a battery of tests, examinations, and consultations. They found a blockage in my left anterior descending artery, a widowmaker as one of the nurses called it. I was lucky to be alive. I quit my job at Answer All. I couldn't face going back there, couldn't face the thought of answering another call, of hearing that voice again. I moved to a new apartment, a small sunny studio on the other side of town. I changed my phone number. I started seeing a therapist, but the calls didn't stop. Every night, at precisely 2 a.m., my phone would ring. The caller ID always showed unknown number, and every night I would answer, because now I knew something the voice didn't. I had survived. I had cheated death. I had changed the future she had predicted, and I needed to know why. The voice continued to reveal secrets, to predict events, to taunt me with my own fears and insecurities. But now there was a difference. She was warning me. She told me about a faulty gas line in my new building, prompting me to call the gas company, who discovered a leak just hours before it could have caused an explosion. She warned me about a drunk driver speeding down my street, giving me just enough time to pull my car to safety before a horrific crash occurred right where I had been parked. She told me about a hidden flaw in a bridge I was planning to cross, leading me to take an alternate route, avoiding a catastrophic collapse that made national headlines. Night after night, the calls continued. The voice, once a source of terror, became a strange sort of guardian angel, a morbid oracle guiding me through a minefield of potential disasters. I still didn't know who she was, or how she knew these things, but I knew I couldn't ignore her. Her warnings were saving my life over and over again. My therapist, Dr. Albright, a calm, reassuring woman with a gentle smile, suggested the calls were a manifestation of my anxiety, a subconscious coping mechanism triggered by my near-death experience. She encouraged me to stop answering, to break the cycle, to focus on the present, not the future. But I couldn't. I knew the voice was real. I knew the warnings were genuine. One night, the call was different. The voice, usually measured and controlled, was laced with a tremor of fear. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the static. "You need to listen to me. He's coming for you." "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Who's coming for me?" "The collector," she replied. "He collects the lost calls, the missed chances, the broken timelines. He feeds on regret, on fear, on unfinished business." I didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" "You cheated death, Eleanor," the voice said, her tone urgent. "You weren't supposed to survive. You disrupted the pattern. And now he's coming to fix it. But why? Why me?" "Because you can hear me," the voice said. "Because you can listen. Because you're a loose end, a thread that needs to be snipped." The static intensified, drowning out her words. I could barely hear her over the crackling and hissing. "What do I do?" I shouted into the phone. "How do I stop him?" The voice faded in and out, fragmented and distorted. "Find him before he finds you." The clock, 11:47 meridian, then silence. The call disconnected. I stared at my phone, my mind racing. The collector, lost calls, broken timelines. 11:47. Meridian. Meridian Plaza. My old office building. The place where this whole nightmare had begun. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. I drove to Meridian Plaza, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. It was late, almost midnight. The city streets were deserted, the towering buildings casting long, ominous shadows. The memory of that night in the elevator, the shifting floors, the impossible realities, came flooding back. I felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to turn around, to go home, to forget all about this. But I couldn't. I had to face this, had to confront whatever was waiting for me. I parked across the street from the building, watching the entrance. The lobby was dimly lit, empty except for a lone security guard slumped behind the desk, seemingly asleep. I checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. 2 minutes. I got out of the car, my legs feeling heavy, my heart pounding in my chest. I crossed the street, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I approached the building entrance. The automatic doors slid open, revealing the empty lobby. The security guard didn't stir. I stepped inside. The air was cold, sterile, with a faint metallic scent that reminded me of the server room, of the shifting floors, of the otherness I had encountered before. I walked towards the elevators, my every sense on high alert. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I reached the elevator bank. There were 4 elevators, their doors closed, their indicator panels displaying the ground floor. I pressed the call button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, repeatedly, frantically. Still nothing. Then I heard it. A faint, grinding sound coming from one of the elevator shafts. The indicator panel above the 3rd elevator flickered to life. The numbers began to change, rapidly, randomly, just like before. 54, 67, 83, 12B, 19X. Oh! The elevator doors opened, and I knew this was it. This was the collector. This was the end of the line. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever awaited me. I stepped inside. The doors closed, and the elevator began to move. Not up, not down, sideways. The familiar, stomach-churning sensation of impossible movement returned. The elevator lurched and groaned, the cables screaming in protest. The floor indicator displayed a chaotic jumble of numbers, symbols, and glyphs, a meaningless cascade of light and static. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. I didn't know what to expect, what form the collector would take, what horrors awaited me on the other side of those doors. But I knew I couldn't run, couldn't hide. I had to face this. The elevator stopped. The doors opened, and I found myself standing in my old office, the 14th floor of Meridian Plaza, exactly as I had left it months ago. My desk, my computer, my coffee cup, still stained with the remnants of that last fateful night. Everything was normal, ordinary, almost disappointingly so. Then I saw him. He was sitting in my chair, his back to me, staring out the window at the city lights. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. His hair was long and black, reaching down to his shoulders. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He just sat there, perfectly still, as if he were a part of the furniture. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He slowly turned his head, his movements fluid and graceful. His face was ordinary, almost disappointingly so. He looked like a businessman, a lawyer, an accountant. But his eyes were ancient, cold, and filled with a chilling emptiness. "I am the collector," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. "I collect the lost calls, the missed chances, the broken timelines. You sent the voice?" I asked. "The warnings?" He nodded slowly. She was a fragment, a piece of a broken timeline trying to repair itself. "And you want to fix it?" He smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I want to collect it," he said, "to erase it, to make it as if it never happened." "And me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What about me?" "You are the anomaly," he said, his gaze piercing. "The loose end, the thread that needs to be snipped." He stood up, his movements smooth and effortless. He was taller than I had realized, towering over me. "But I helped people," I said, desperately trying to reason with him. "I saved lives." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You disrupted the natural order. You interfered with the flow of time. You created ripples." He reached out, his hand extended towards me. His fingers were long and thin, almost skeletal. "It's time to go back, Eleanor," he said. "Back to where you belong. Back to 3:34 a.m. Back to the moment of my death." I knew I should run, should fight, should do something, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, by the sheer, overwhelming presence of this being. His fingers brushed against my cheek, a touch that was both ice-cold and burning hot. And then, everything went black. I woke up in my apartment. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The digital clock on my nightstand showed 7 a.m. It was a Tuesday. I felt different, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I got out of bed, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My reflection stared back at me. Normal, ordinary, but something was off. I couldn't quite place it at first. Then I noticed it, my left eyebrow. There was no scar. The small, crescent-shaped scar I had carried since childhood. The scar the voice on the phone had described with such chilling accuracy was gone. My heart pounded in my chest. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I stumbled back, clutching at the sink for support. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No messages. No record of any calls from unknown number. I checked my bank account. The balance was different. Higher. I had paid my rent. I checked my browser history. No searches for motels, for identity theft, for ways to disappear. It was as if the past several months had been erased, as if they had never happened. I was back in my original timeline. The collector had succeeded. He had fixed the anomaly. But at what cost? I remembered the voice, the warnings, the lives I had saved. Those events were gone now, erased from existence. The gas leak, the drunk driver, the bridge collapse. Had they happened? Would they happen again? And what about the others? The people I had indirectly saved? Were they now dead? I felt a surge of nausea, a wave of guilt and horror. I had been given a second chance, a clean slate, but at the expense of others. I had been erased, but at what cost? I sat down on the edge of the bathtub, my head in my hands. I was alive. I was safe. But I was also lost. A fragment of a broken timeline, returned to its proper place, but forever altered, forever haunted by the knowledge of what had been and what could have been. The silence of my apartment was deafening. No more whispers, no more warnings, no more calls, just the steady, rhythmic drip of the faucet in the sink.
Drip, drip, drip.
A sound that, for the first time in months, filled me not with terror, but with a profound, unsettling sense of emptiness. And, as I looked at the perfect reflection, I wondered if the small price I personally paid was worth reverting what I had changed. And I wasn't sure. The highway haunting. I was driving on the back roads, pushing the speed limit a bit, on the outskirts of the city limits. It was dark, a moonless night, with only the occasional isolated rest stop breaking the monotony of the highway. I was on my way to meet a woman I'd connected with on Craigslist, a situation that already had my nerves on edge. The road was deserted. I hadn't seen another car in miles. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I saw a second figure also running, chasing the first. I swerved instinctively to avoid hitting the first man, slamming on my brakes at the same time. My car skidded, going sideways, and I felt a sickening thud. I'd hit the second man, though thankfully not at full speed. My car came to a stop on the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The first man, the one I'd swerved to avoid, had vanished. He was nowhere to be seen. This in itself was a huge red flag, a warning sign that something wasn't right. But I just hit someone, and my immediate concern was for his well-being. I scrambled out of the car, my hands shaking, a sinking feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. I ran towards the man who was lying on the ground, breathing heavily. Thank God he was alive. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, just continued to breathe heavily, his chest rising and falling rapidly. I pulled out my phone, intending to call 911. As I was typing in the number, I heard him speak, his voice strained and alarmed.
No.
"Don't call anyone. Don't call the cops." I froze, my phone still in my hand, the flashlight illuminating his face. I looked at him, my confusion growing. "Can you stand?" I asked. He slowly got to his feet, favoring one leg slightly, a noticeable limp. With my phone's light shining on him, I could see that his clothes were tattered, worn, and he was wearing 2 layers, the outer jacket now torn at the arms. There was blood on his arms, presumably from where he'd landed on the pavement. He spoke again, his voice calmer now. "I'm fine. Do you have any cigarettes?" I did as it happened. I was an occasional smoker, and I had a pack in my glove compartment that had been there for ages. "Yeah, let me go get them," I said. We walked back to my car, and I retrieved the cigarettes, handing them to him. I put my phone on the charger, the car still running. He asked for a lighter, and I told him to hold on while I looked for one. As he lit his cigarette, I asked him, "Who was the other guy?" "Someone stole my backpack from me when I was sleeping," he replied. "Oh, okay." He was clearly homeless, a transient. I felt a surge of guilt, of responsibility for his injuries. I started pulling out my wallet, intending to give him all the cash I had, a desperate attempt to alleviate my guilt. He seemed fine now. The bleeding had stopped. His breathing had returned to normal. As I was pulling out my wallet, asking, "Are you sure you don't want me to call an ambulance?" That's when it happened. The sharpest pain I'd ever felt exploded across my face. My vision blurred, my head spinning. I stumbled, my body feeling weak, on the verge of collapsing. I was dizzy, disoriented. When I regained my senses, I saw my car pulling away, speeding off into the darkness. He'd punched me and stolen my car. He'd left me stranded on the side of a deserted highway, with a throbbing headache and a growing sense of disbelief. I stood there, in shock, for what felt like an eternity. My first instinct was to reach for my phone, to call for help. Then I remembered I'd left it charging in the car. Crap. I reached under my jacket, my hand instinctively going to my side. Relief washed over me as I felt the reassuring weight of my gun. Okay, good. At least I wasn't completely defenseless. I started walking, trudging down the endless highway, hoping to find some sign of civilization, some way to call for help. My anger mingled with my fear, creating a volatile cocktail of emotions. After what felt like miles, I saw lights in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was one of those public restrooms, the kind you find at rest stops, but with nothing else around. Well, that's something, I thought. There might be a payphone. And then I saw it. Parked right in front of the restroom was a car that looked exactly like mine. I cautiously approached, peering inside. The man who had stolen my car was asleep, slumped over in the driver's seat. He appeared to have cleaned his arms. The jacket was gone. That __. He could have kept driving, but thankfully he hadn't. I pulled out my gun, my hand trembling slightly. I tried the door handle. It was locked. I tried all the doors, but they were all locked. I didn't want to wake him up by banging on the car, fearing he'd try to drive off again. I scanned the ground, searching for something to break the window, but there was nothing. So I made a decision. I holstered my gun, took off my jacket, and wrapped it around my hand. I smashed the window, the glass shattering with a loud crash, scattering fragments across the interior. The man jerked awake, startled, fumbling around in a daze. I quickly dropped the jacket, unholstered my gun again, and pointed it directly at his head. "Please don't shoot me," he pleaded, his voice filled with terror. Instead of apologizing, instead of expressing any remorse for what he'd done, he begged for his life. "Get out of the car," I ordered, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and adrenaline. "Walk towards the wall, with your back turned." I backed up, keeping my gun trained on him, and he complied. I told him not to move, and then I asked him where my keys were. After retrieving my keys, I drove off, leaving him stranded at the restroom, my car now littered with broken glass. I never called the police. I was afraid. I'd hit him with my car, even if it was an accident, and then I'd pulled a gun on him. I was worried about the legality of it all. Plus, I'd purchased the gun from a private seller on ArmsList, and the seller had never signed the bill of sale. Only I had. It was a sketchy situation, and I didn't want to risk the police investigating the gun, especially if the man told them about the incident. I never met up with the Craigslist girl, the unwelcome advance. I'm a college-aged woman, and for a while, I worked at a rather unique establishment, an Irish pub. Despite being located in a college townish area, this pub's primary clientele consisted of men and women aged 40 and over. Seeing another young person there was a rarity. The pub was owned by 3 older men, a trio who seemed to view the place as their personal watering hole. They'd frequently drop in, expecting free drinks for themselves and their extensive entourage of friends, while simultaneously treating the staff with a distinct lack of respect. They demanded impeccable service, expecting us to have their every order memorized, yet their appreciation was often lacking. This particular Friday night was one of those nights. I was working the closing server shift, which meant that once my section was cleared and everything was cleaned and prepped for the following day's shift, I could clock out at 11 p.m. It had been an agonizingly slow night. I hadn't had a table in over 2 hours. I diligently completed all my cleaning duties, set up for the next day's crew, and was essentially just killing time, nearing the end of my shift. I was tired, mentally and physically, and simply wanted to go home. I was chatting with the other bartenders, a common pastime during slow periods. Then, at approximately 10:55 p.m., just as I was envisioning my escape, one of the owners, a man named Richard, waltzed in with a massive group of his friends, around 30 people. They arrived without warning, a boisterous, demanding horde that completely overwhelmed my section of tables. The bartender I was talking to even tried to subtly hide behind me, hoping to avoid Richard's inevitable request for him to stay late. Richard had a habit of demanding a server, even if his group never actually sat at a table. And when it came to tipping, it was a coin toss. You might get a generous 20%, or you might get nothing at all. Unfortunately, Richard spotted me. He looked me directly in the eye and asked, with a tone that implied it wasn't really a question, "So, are there any servers still out that can help us?" I sighed internally, accepting my fate. At least I thought if I played my cards right, I might be able to squeeze a decent tip out of the rest of the group. I put on my best customer service smile and went into full-fledged cocktail waitress mode. I was attentive, efficient, and proactive. No one's beer glass was ever empty. If I noticed someone looking a little worse for wear, I'd discreetly arrange for a ride home. I handed out water bottles to those who seemed to be overindulging. Food orders were in and out of the kitchen with lightning speed. Everyone seemed to be having a great time, and the night, surprisingly, started to turn around. Members of the group were slipping me cash here and there, small tokens of appreciation for my efforts. As the night finally wound down, around 2 a.m., 3 of the men in the group called me over. I approached them, maintaining my weary but cheerful demeanor. I dealt with plenty of creepy old men in my time working at the pub, and I'd learned to shrug off their awkward attempts at flirting. However, I had a zero-tolerance policy for disrespect, regardless of who the offender might be. This particular conversation started out innocently enough, even amusingly. Old guy number 3, a man named George, was a 78-year-old who I'd served at least 5 beers and 2 shots to throughout the evening. Guy number 1, whose name I'll call Frank, said, "So, forgive us if this is a little crass of a question, but it's been a funny debate all night, and we need a final woman's opinion. Beard or no beard?" I replied with a playful smile, "Oh, well, of course a beard. I gotta say, I love my fiancé, Samuel's beard." Guy number 2, let's call him Bill, chimed in, "But doesn't it feel weird when you kiss him? Tickle your lips or scratch? Leftover food?" I laughed. "Not as much as you think. Can be a little scratchy when it's a certain length, but you tend not to notice it after a while. Besides, he keeps his clean. Do you want me to grab you a wipey, since you seem to need the help?" We were all laughing, the conversation light and jovial. Bill said, "You know, I may take you up on that one. So, if he cut his beard, would you be upset or what?" I shrugged. "Nope, that's entirely up to him. If anything, it just takes some getting used to. But every girl's different, I suppose. Everyone may prefer something different." Then old guy number 3, George, spoke, and everything changed. He started lightly stroking my hair, a gesture that immediately made me uncomfortable. "So you like the beard, huh? The whiskers turn you on?" I replied, trying to maintain a light tone, despite my growing unease. "Yeah, I wouldn't go that far, but to each her own." Then he did it. He put his arm around my waist, pulling me close against his chest, leaning down to whisper in my ear. Before I could protest, before I could react, he said, in a low, suggestive voice, "I bet those whiskers feel real good between those nice legs of yours, too, huh? I bet your fella can't compete." He then proceeded to wiggle his eyebrows at me, a lewd, disgusting gesture. I was stunned, speechless with shock and disgust. No one had ever said anything so blatant, so disrespectful to me before. I forcefully ripped myself out of his grasp, my anger flaring. He was surprised by my reaction, but he tried to laugh it off, attempting to hush me and talk over me. The other 2 men, Frank and Bill, looked utterly confused, asking what he'd said. I dealt with creepy flirting, even stalking, but nothing as brazen as this. I didn't hesitate, I told Frank and Bill exactly what George had said, my voice shaking with anger and indignation. They looked absolutely disgusted with him. They immediately went to the bartender and the head chef, both of whom were like protective older brothers to all the waitresses, and recounted the incident. The bartender and chef were furious, ready to confront George. But by the time they reached our area, Richard, the owner, had gathered the group for a large photo before they departed. I did, however, get a small measure of revenge. I worked the next morning, and a large group of elderly women came in. It turned out they were the wives of the men from the previous night. When they realized I was one of the servers who'd served their husbands, they asked for all the details. I felt a pang of sympathy for George's poor wife, but I also saw the burning rage in her eyes when I recounted her husband's disgusting comment. The consequences of his actions, I hoped, would be severe. The encounter left me shaken, but even angrier than before. The mall stalker. I'll be turning 22 at the end of this month, and this event happened almost a decade ago, when I was on the cusp of becoming a teenager. Yet, the memory remains remarkably vivid, a chilling episode that I still reflect upon frequently. I often bring it up with my family, despite the discomfort it evokes, because it serves as a stark reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk in seemingly ordinary situations. As a bit of background, I've always had exceptionally fair skin, blonde hair, and light-colored eyes, features that, unfortunately, tend to attract a certain type of unsavory individual. When I was around 12, my older sister, Sarah, who is 8 years my senior, was serving in the military. She'd been stationed away from home for a considerable period. Finally, she was returning to the United States, to a base in Kentucky, a few states away from our home. My parents, Robert and Linda, and I were ecstatic. We planned a weekend trip to see her, eager to reunite after her long absence. It would only be a brief visit, but we were thrilled at the prospect of spending time with her. We met up with Sarah, and the ensuing days were filled with joy and reunion. We went out to eat, opened the accumulated Christmas presents she'd missed, and, of course, visited a nearby mall, a quintessential American pastime. I've never witnessed someone so utterly delighted to simply wear normal civilian clothes. Our last night together, however, took an unsettling turn. As we walked to the mall, a strange feeling of unease crept over me. It was that inexplicable sense of something being off, a vibe that often accompanies unfamiliar surroundings. It wasn't particularly late, but closing time was approaching around 10 p.m. at that time. Malls, as you know, are predictable. You enter, you browse, you might buy something. The four of us, Sarah, my parents, and I eventually found ourselves in the last store we'd be visiting before heading back to the hotel. It wasn't a store I'd typically frequent. It specialized in expensive streetwear clothing. As the restless 12-year-old I was, I wandered around, flitting between my parents, pestering my mother with requests, while Sarah browsed the merchandise. Suddenly, Sarah approached my mother and whispered something to her, her voice urgent and low. A man, with a strikingly prominent black mustache, a detail I vividly remember, had been following us, engaging in the typical retail routine of offering assistance, but with an unsettling persistence. He was only addressing my father, ignoring the rest of us. The man didn't speak broken English, but his accent was incredibly thick, possibly Indian or Turkish, we speculated. Sarah and my mother, their instincts alerted, walked out of the store, keeping a watchful eye on my father and me. All right, let's go now, look. Me being 12 and sensing the rising unease. I don't immediately understand why my mother and sister want to leave but start following. My father, noticing our departure, began to follow suit, but the man intercepted him. I was still within earshot, and what I heard next sent a chill down my spine. The man, looking away from me and directly at my father, asked, "So, how much for the little one?" My father, understandably confused, let out an uncomfortable chuckle, assuming it was some kind of tasteless, poorly executed joke. My mother and sister, unaware of this exchange, were waiting for us several feet away. "What?" my father asked, hoping for clarification, for some indication that he'd misheard. The man then reiterated his question, stating with chilling clarity that he wanted to purchase me. My father's demeanor instantly shifted. His protective instincts kicked in, his voice rising with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "We don't do that here," he said, his tone sharp and unwavering. He quickly ushered me towards my mother and sister, and we started to leave, my father explaining the horrifying exchange. The entire drive back to the hotel, Sarah was seething with anger, repeatedly saying that if she'd known, she would have killed him. Looking back, I'm not sure what we could have done differently, but the entire situation was profoundly disturbing, especially once I fully grasped the implications of the man's offer. We never set foot in that store again. The memory remains a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of children and the predatory nature of some individuals. The handprint on the steel door. The warehouse was silent, a vast, echoing cavern of concrete and steel. At 3 a.m., the only sounds were the distant hum of the city and the occasional creak of the building settling.
Samuel Sambel.
Had worked the night shift at Global Distribution Logistics for 5 years. It was a monotonous job, checking inventory, moving pallets, ensuring the loading docks were secure, but it paid the bills. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw it. A handprint on the steel fire door of my own apartment building. Not a smudge, not a smear, but a clear, distinct handprint, pressed into the metal as if the steel had been soft as clay. And it was large, far larger than any human hand I'd ever seen. The fingers were elongated, the palm impossibly wide. My head throbbed with a dull ache, the residue of a long, tiring shift. I just wanted to get home, shower, and collapse into bed. I lived alone in a small, one-bedroom apartment in a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Kids? I muttered to myself, shaking my head, messing around. I tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as a prank, some teenagers with too much time and too little sense. But a nagging unease, a prickling at the back of my neck, told me otherwise. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, quiet, exactly as I had left it. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, kicked off my steel-toed boots, and headed straight for the shower. The hot water eased the tension in my muscles, washing away the grime and fatigue of the night shift. I stood under the spray for a long time, letting the water cascade over me, trying to clear my head. I dried off, pulled on a clean t-shirt and boxers, and walked into the bedroom. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed red. 4:47 a.m. I collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion pulling me down into a deep, dreamless sleep. Bang! My eyes snapped open. I sat up, my heart pounding, every muscle tense. The sound had come from the kitchen, like someone had slammed a cabinet door. I lay there, listening, my senses on high alert. The apartment was silent. For a long moment, I heard nothing. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city outside. Then it came again. A soft, rhythmic creaking, followed by the distinct sound of drawers being opened and closed. One after another. Slowly, deliberately, my throat tightened. I lived alone. Nobody else had a key to my apartment. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, intending to call 911, but my hand froze. The phone wasn't there. I remembered, with a jolt of panic, that I had left it charging in the kitchen. Another drawer opened, followed by the clatter of metal utensils. I eased myself out of bed, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The floorboards creaked under my weight, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the apartment. The sounds in the kitchen stopped. Complete silence. I had a baseball bat in my closet, a relic from my college days. I crept towards the closet, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hand gripping an imaginary handle. I reached the closet, slowly opened the door, and pulled out the bat. The wood felt cold and solid in my hands, a small measure of reassurance in the face of the unknown. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Then, I moved towards the bedroom door, the bat raised, ready to strike. The door was slightly ajar, a narrow sliver of darkness showing the hallway beyond. I listened intently, straining to hear any sound. Nothing. Then, footsteps. Heavy footsteps. But wrong. Not the rhythmic, even tread of a human walking. These were irregular, uneven, like something dragging itself across the floor. The footsteps grew closer, moving down the hallway towards my bedroom, and they were accompanied by another sound. A wet, slapping sound, like bare feet on a damp surface. A shadow passed through the sliver of darkness visible through the doorway. Too tall, too wide. The footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom door, and I heard breathing, wet, raspy breathing, like something struggling to draw air through fluid-filled lungs. The door began to creak open, slowly, steadily. I raised the bat higher, my muscles coiled, ready to unleash all my strength on whatever stood on the other side of that door. My heart felt like it would explode. The door swung open wider, revealing. The creature that stood in my doorway defied any rational explanation, any earthly comparison. It was tall, impossibly so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its skin was a sickly, grayish-green, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. But it was the proportions that were truly horrifying. Its arms were elongated, dangling almost to its knees, ending in massive hands, far too large for its body. The fingers were long and bony, tipped with thick, yellowed nails. Its legs were bent backward at the knees, like a bird's, giving it an unsettling, jerky gait. And its face, it had no features, no eyes, no nose, no ears. Just a gaping, horizontal slit where a mouth should be, stretching from one side of its head to the other. And within that slit, rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth, glinting in the dim light, dark, viscous fluid, not water. Something thicker, oilier, dripped from its chin, splattering onto my carpet with a sickening hiss. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was frozen, paralyzed by a terror so profound it defied words. The creature's mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, revealing the full horror of its dentition. Rows upon rows of teeth extending far back into its throat. The wet, rasping breathing intensified, filling the room with a stench of decay and stagnant water. Took a step forward, its backward bent legs making its movement jerky and unnatural. Those massive hands, the hands that matched the print on my door, swung at its sides, the fingers twitching involuntarily. My survival instinct, buried beneath layers of fear and disbelief, finally kicked in. I swung the bat with all my might. The wood connected with the creature's torso with a sickening thud. But instead of staggering back, instead of showing any sign of pain, the creature didn't even flinch. The bat simply bounced off, as if I had struck solid steel. The impact sent vibrations up my arms, numbing my hands. I dropped the bat, the clatter echoing loudly in the suddenly silent room. The creature reached for me. I ducked under its arm, a desperate, instinctive move that saved me from being instantly crushed. The creature's hand, larger than my head, slammed into the wall, leaving a deep indentation in the plaster. I scrambled backward, away from the creature, my mind racing. I had to get out, had to escape. But where could I go? The creature followed, its movements surprisingly fast for its size. It filled the doorway, blocking my escape route to the hallway. I was trapped. I rolled to the side, dodging another swipe of its hand. My shoulder slammed into the nightstand, sending the digital clock flying. It shattered against the wall, its red numbers scattering like drops of blood. The creature lunged again, its gaping maw opening wider, revealing the full horror of its throat. A dark, seemingly endless tunnel lined with rows upon rows of teeth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not towards the door, but towards the window. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was my only chance. The window was closed, locked. I fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Behind me, I heard the creature moving closer, its wet, slapping footsteps echoing on the carpet. I finally managed to unlock the window, shoving it upward with all my remaining strength. The cool night air rushed in, a welcome relief from the stifling, fetid air of the room. I scrambled onto the windowsill, preparing to jump. It was a 2-story drop, but I didn't care. I'd rather risk broken bones than face that thing. Then I felt it, a cold, vice-like grip around my ankle. The creature had grabbed me. Its fingers, impossibly strong, tightened their hold, crushing the bones in my ankle. I screamed, a raw, primal scream of pain and terror. Pulled me back, dragging me away from the window, away from freedom, away from any hope of escape. I thrashed, I kicked, I clawed, but it was useless. The creature was too strong, too powerful. It lifted me off the ground, effortlessly, as if I weighed nothing. It held me suspended in the air, my body dangling helplessly. And then, it brought me closer to its face. That gaping, tooth-filled maw opened wider and wider and wider. The stench of decay and stagnant water washed over me, suffocating me, making me gag. I could see down its throat, a dark, endless abyss lined with countless rows of razor-sharp teeth. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. I knew this was the end. There was no escape. Then, something unexpected happened. The creature hesitated. Its grip on my ankle loosened, just slightly. The wet, rasping breathing, which had been a constant, terrifying presence, faltered. I opened my eyes, cautiously, fearfully. The creature was still holding me, but it wasn't moving. It was staring, not at me, but past me, at the window. I followed its gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, in the pre-dawn light, something was moving, a figure, tall and thin, shrouded in shadow. It stood motionless on the lawn below, staring up at my window. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the lightning sky. But I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that it was the same figure I had seen in the warehouse, the same figure that had left the handprint on my door. The creature holding me made a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through its entire body. It tightened its grip on my ankle, its fingers digging into my flesh. But it didn't pull me closer. It didn't try to devour me. It was afraid. The figure outside didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The creature holding me began to tremble, its entire body shaking violently. The dark fluid dripping from its chin increased, splattering onto the floor, hissing and steaming where it landed. Then, with a sudden, convulsive movement, it threw me. I went flying across the room, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. I slumped to the floor, my body racked with pain, my vision blurring. I looked up, expecting to see the creature looming over me, ready to finish what it had started. But it was gone. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the pre-dawn breeze. The room was empty. The only evidence that the creature had ever been there was the lingering stench of decay. The dark fluid splattered on the floor and walls, and the searing pain in my ankle. I lay there for a long time, too weak, too terrified to move. As the sun rose, casting its golden rays through the window, I finally managed to crawl to my phone, which had somehow survived the encounter. I dialed 911, my voice hoarse and trembling. I told them everything, about the handprint, the footsteps, the creature, the figure outside. They didn't believe me. Of course, they didn't. They sent a patrol car, but the officers found nothing. No creature, no figure, no evidence of forced entry. They took my statement, gave me a referral to a psychiatrist, and left. I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment. I packed a bag, taking only the essentials, and checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. I spent the next few days trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to find some rational explanation. But there wasn't one. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. And I knew that the creature, whatever it was still out there. And so was the figure, the one who had saved me. I didn't know who or what it was, but I knew one thing. It was connected to the creature, and it was the only reason I was still alive. I decided I would find it. I started by going back to the warehouse, to Global Distribution Logistics. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to start somewhere. I had to find out if anyone else had seen anything, experienced anything similar. I waited until the night shift, until the familiar routine of trucks arriving and departing, of forklifts beeping and pallets being moved, filled the air. I found a spot across the street, hidden in the shadows, where I could observe the building without being seen. I watched, and I waited. Hours passed. Nothing. The warehouse seemed normal, ordinary. Then I saw him, one of the night shift workers, a young man I recognized from my time there, stepped outside for a smoke break. He leaned against the wall, lit a cigarette, and looked up at the sky. And then he froze. His body went rigid, his eyes wide with terror. He dropped his cigarette, his hand reaching out towards nothing. I knew with a sickening certainty what he was seeing. The figure. I watched as the young man stumbled backward, his mouth opening in a silent scream. He turned and ran back inside the warehouse, disappearing from view. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see the creature emerge from the building, pursuing its prey. But nothing happened. After a few minutes, the young man came back outside, accompanied by two other workers. They were talking, gesturing, pointing at the sky, but there was nothing there. I knew then that I wasn't alone. Others had seen it. Others had experienced the same terror. I decided to approach the young man. I had to talk to him to find out what he had seen, what he knew. I waited until he was alone again. Then I crossed the street, approaching him cautiously. "Hey," I said, my voice low. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" He looked at me, his eyes still wide with fear, his face pale. Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "My name is Sam," I said. "I used to work here. I saw what happened. I saw you react." He stared at me, his expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. You saw it?" he whispered. "Yes," I said. "I saw it, and I know what it is." He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the pepper spray on his belt. "Stay away from me," he said. You're one of them." "No," I said, raising my hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not. I'm trying to understand it, to stop it." I told him my story, everything that had happened, from the handprint on my door to the creature in my apartment to the figure outside my window. He listened intently, his initial fear slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. I saw it too," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A few weeks ago, standing at the edge of the parking lot, just watching. Did it do anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, it just stood there, but I felt cold, so cold, and afraid, like something was about to die." "And tonight?" I asked. "What did you see tonight?" "The same thing," he said, "but closer, and it was pointing at me." "Pointing?" I repeated, a chill running down my spine. The figure outside my window, had it been pointing, too, at the creature, or at me? I don't want to talk about it anymore," the young man said, his voice shaking. He turned to go back inside. "Wait," I said, stopping him. "Do you know anything about this place? About the history of this site?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Just rumors, stories. They say this land used to be something else, a long time ago, before the warehouse, before everything. Something else." Pressed. "Like what?" He shrugged, his eyes darting nervously around. "I don't know. Something bad. Someplace people disappeared." He turned and hurried back inside, leaving me alone in the darkness. His words echoed in my mind. Someplace people disappeared. I knew I had to dig deeper. I had to find out what had happened on this land, what secrets lay buried beneath the concrete and steel of the warehouse. I spent the next few days at the local library, poring over historical records, newspaper archives, old maps. I learned that the area where the warehouse now stood had once been a rural community, a small farming village that had vanished in the late 19th century. There were no records of a fire, a flood, or any other natural disaster that could explain the village's disappearance. Just gone. I found a few old newspaper articles mentioning strange occurrences in the area. Unexplained lights, missing livestock, people vanishing without a trace. The stories were dismissed as folklore, as tall tales, but they resonated with what I had experienced, with what the young man at the warehouse had described. Then I found it, a small, obscure article from 1888, tucked away in the back pages of a long-defunct local newspaper. The headline read, "Mystery Deepens in Vanishing Village." The article described the disappearance of several residents from the village of Oakhaven, the community that had once occupied the land where the warehouse now stood. The disappearances were all preceded by strange sightings. A tall, dark figure lurking at the edge of the woods, glowing eyes in the night, unexplained footprints in the mud. The article mentioned a local legend, a story passed down through generations, about a creature that lived in the darkness, a creature that fed on fear and loneliness, a creature that could take the form of its victims' deepest anxieties. The article ended with a chilling quote from a local farmer. "It's the Shadow Man. He's come back, and he's hungry." The Shadow Man. The name sent a shiver down my spine. It was the same creature, I was sure of it. The same creature that had haunted my apartment, that had stalked the warehouse workers, that had been lurking in the darkness for over a century. And the figure? The one that had seemingly saved me? I had a theory, a terrifying, impossible theory. What if the figure wasn't protecting me from the creature? What if it was protecting the creature from me? What if it was a guardian, a shepherd? And what if the creature, the Shadow Man, wasn't just feeding on fear, but on souls? The handprint, the size, everything fit. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The Shadow Man wasn't just a monster. It was a predator, a collector of souls. And the figure, the tall, dark figure with the outstretched arm, it wasn't a savior. It was a herder, a guide, leading its prey to the slaughter. The young man at the warehouse, he'd said the figure had been pointing at him. Pointing him towards what? Towards the Shadow Man? Towards his doom? I had to warn him. I had to tell him what I had discovered, what I suspected. I drove back to the warehouse, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. It was late, almost 2 a.m. The night shift would be in full swing. I found the young man, whose name I learned was Mark, outside taking another smoke break. He looked even more nervous than before, his eyes darting around as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. "Mark," I said, approaching him cautiously. "I need to talk to you. It's important." He looked at me, his expression a mixture of fear and suspicion. "I told you, I don't want anything to do with you. You're cursed." "I know," I said, "and so are you. We both saw it. We both know it's real." I told him about the newspaper article, about the legend of the Shadow Man, about my theory of the figure being a herder. He listened, his eyes widening with each horrifying detail. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We fight," I said. "We find a way to stop it, before it claims anyone else." "But how?" he asked, his voice laced with despair. It's not human. It's something else." "I don't know," I admitted, "but we have to try. We have to find its weakness, its vulnerability." I remembered the creature's reaction in my apartment, when the figure had appeared outside the window. The fear in its eyes, the way it had trembled, the way it had released me. The figure, I said, my mind racing. It's afraid of the figure. Maybe the figure is the key. But the figure, it's part of it, isn't it? Mark asked. "You said it's a herder." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a prisoner, a victim, forced to serve the Shadow Man." It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all I had. I knew I had to find the figure again. I had to understand its connection to the Shadow Man, and I had to do it before the Shadow Man claimed another victim. I looked at Mark, his face pale and drawn in the harsh glare of the warehouse lights. "Will you help me?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I will." We had a plan, a dangerous, reckless plan, but it was the only chance we had. We were going to hunt the Shadow Man. We started by gathering information. We spent hours at the library, poring over old newspapers, historical records, and local folklore. We interviewed elderly residents of the area, collecting stories, legends, and rumors about the vanished village of Oakhaven and the strange occurrences that had plagued the area for over a century. We learned that the disappearances had always been preceded by sightings of the tall, dark figure, always at night, always near the edge of the woods or fields. The figure was described as having a distorted, unnatural gait, and its presence was always accompanied by a feeling of intense cold and a sense of overwhelming dread. We also discovered a recurring symbol, a strange, angular glyph that appeared in several of the old newspaper articles, etched into the walls of abandoned buildings, carved into trees, and even found on a few of the recovered personal belongings of the missing villagers. It was the same symbol I had seen on the door of the office trailer at the construction site. The symbol, we learned, was associated with an ancient Native American legend, a story about a being that lived in the shadows, a being that could steal people's souls, leaving behind only empty shells. The legend spoke of a way to defeat the being, a ritual that involved fire, light, and a specific incantation. But the details of the ritual were lost, scattered fragments of a forgotten language. We spent days trying to piece together the ritual, consulting with linguists, historians, and even a few self-proclaimed experts in the occult. We gathered the necessary materials: candles, herbs, a silver knife, and a copy of the ancient text containing the incantation, painstakingly translated from fragments of the original language. Our plan was to perform the ritual at the heart of the old village, the spot where the warehouse now stood, on the night of the new moon, when the darkness was at its deepest. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but we were running out of time. Mark had seen the figure again, closer this time, standing in his backyard, staring at his bedroom window. He was terrified, barely able to sleep, convinced that he was next. The night of the new moon arrived, cold and clear. We drove to the warehouse, our hearts pounding in our chests, our minds filled with a mixture of fear and determination. We parked a distance away, hidden in the shadows, and approached the building on foot. The warehouse loomed before us, a dark, silent behemoth against the starless sky. We slipped inside through a broken window, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. We made our way to the center of the warehouse, the spot where, according to our research, the old village square had once been. We set up the ritual, carefully arranging the candles, the herbs, the silver knife. We lit the candles, their flames flickering in the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the concrete walls. I began to chant the incantation, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as I repeated the ancient words, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange on my tongue. The air grew colder, the metallic scent intensified, and then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the vast emptiness of the warehouse. The Shadow Man had arrived. "Please let me know when to continue." The growl grew louder, closer, accompanied by the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps. The candles flickered violently, threatening to extinguish. Then we saw it, a darkness, deeper than the surrounding shadows, coalescing at the far end of the warehouse. It was shapeless at first, a swirling vortex of black, but as it approached, it began to take on a form. Tall, gaunt, with limbs that were too long, too thin, a head that was too small, tilted at an unnatural angle, and a gaping horizontal slit where a mouth should be, filled with rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth. The Shadow Man. It moved towards us, its gait uneven, jerky, its massive hands swinging at its sides. The air around it shimmered, distorting the light, making it difficult to focus on its form. I continued chanting, my voice rising above the growl of the creature, the words of the incantation pouring from my lips. Mark stood beside me, his body trembling, his eyes fixed on the approaching darkness. He held the silver knife in his hand, his knuckles white with tension. The Shadow Man stopped about 20 feet away, its form flickering, wavering, as if struggling to maintain its shape. It emitted a low, hissing sound, like air escaping from a punctured tire. Then it spoke. Its voice was a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of lost souls, echoing through the warehouse. "You cannot stop me," it hissed. "I am eternal. We can try," I shouted back, my voice surprisingly steady. "We know your name. We know your weakness." The Shadow Man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that made my skin crawl. "Names have no power over me," it whispered. "I am beyond names." It lunged forward, its massive hand reaching for us. Mark screamed and charged, plunging the silver knife into the creature's chest. The knife met resistance. Not flesh, not bone, but something else. Something cold and hard and empty. The Shadow Man recoiled, its form flickering violently. It emitted a high-pitched shriek, a sound of pain and rage. The silver knife had worked. It had hurt the creature. I continued chanting, the words of the incantation flowing from my lips, faster now, more urgent. The candles flared brighter, their flames burning with an unnatural intensity. The air around us shimmered, crackled with energy. The Shadow Man lunged again, but this time I was ready. I raised my hand, focusing all my will, all my energy, on the words of the incantation, on the power of the ritual. A beam of light, pure and white, shot forth from my hand, striking the creature in the chest. The Shadow Man screamed again, a sound of pure agony. Its form began to unravel, to dissolve, to break apart into swirling shadows, into fragments of darkness. It thrashed, it writhed, it fought, but the light held it fast, consuming it, erasing it. Then, with a final, deafening shriek, it was gone. The silence returned, sudden and absolute. The candles flickered and died. The air grew warm again. Mark stood beside me, his body trembling, the silver knife still clutched in his hand. We had done it. We had defeated the Shadow Man. We stood there for a long time, breathing heavily, our bodies exhausted, our minds reeling from what had just happened. The warehouse felt different now, lighter somehow. The oppressive silence had lifted, replaced by the familiar sounds of the city outside. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We had shared an experience that had bonded us together, a terrifying, impossible experience that had changed us forever. We gathered our materials, extinguished the remaining embers of the herbs, and left the warehouse, stepping out into the cool night air. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the eastern horizon with streaks of pink and orange. We walked to our vehicles, still silent, still processing what had happened. As I was about to get into my truck, I saw it, standing at the edge of the parking lot. Near the spot where Mark had seen it before was the figure. Tall, dark, its face obscured by shadow. It was watching us, pointed, my hand trembling. "Mark," I whispered. "Look." Mark followed my gaze. He froze, his eyes widening in fear. It's back," he stammered. But I knew. It wasn't back. It had been there all along. It wasn't the Shadow Man. It was something else. Something different. The figure raised its arm, its hand outstretched, not in a threatening gesture, but in a salute, a farewell. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the early morning. We watched it go, our hearts pounding in our chests. We didn't understand. We didn't know what it was, what it wanted, why it had been there. But we knew one thing. It was connected to the Shadow Man, to the darkness that had haunted this land for over a century. And now that darkness was gone. We had banished it, but the figure remained. A silent observer, a watchful guardian, or perhaps something else entirely. We drove away, leaving the warehouse behind, leaving the mystery of the figure unsolved. But we knew with a certainty that defied logic, that we would never forget what had happened that night. We would never forget the Shadow Man, and we would never forget the figure in the fog. The world felt different now. The darkness felt thinner. The silence felt lighter. But we knew that somewhere out there in the shadows, in the between spaces, other creatures lurked. Other mysteries waited to be uncovered. And we knew that we would be ready. We had faced the darkness and we had survived. And that, we realized, was all that mattered. We would keep watching, and if needed, we would fight again. Because some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. The chase in the darkness. Years ago, when I was a teenager, my friend Jasper and I had a shared passion for longboarding, particularly at night. We were quintessential night owls, reveling in the freedom of the deserted roads and pathways. We'd rarely encounter another soul, even when venturing onto main roads. Vehicles were a scarce sight in our rural area at such late hours, their headlights and engine noise easily detectable from a distance. We were deeply immersed in the longboarding culture at the time, often riding for miles, sometimes not returning home until the first rays of dawn painted the sky. One particular night, we decided to deviate from our usual back roads and explore one of our favorite hidden routes. This route began with a narrow, paved path, a thin strip of land separating two sides of a long lake. The path was prone to flooding, often sinking beneath the water after heavy rain. We were eager to ride it before the next downpour rendered it impassable. It was roughly 2 miles long, and the scenery, even in the darkness, was incredibly serene. After reaching the end of the lake path, we decided to continue our adventure, turning onto a secluded path that led directly into a dense, wooded wilderness preservation area. As we approached the first hill, we peered down into the inky blackness below. And that's when we saw it. A tiny, flickering ball of dim light, moving erratically at the bottom of the hill. It was difficult to discern what it was, its movements strange and unpredictable. Instead of immediately shining our flashlights down, we opted for cautious observation. We watched it for several minutes, whispering to each other, speculating about its nature. Could it be an animal? A reflection? Something else entirely? Then, in an instant, the single, small light transformed into multiple, blindingly bright lights. Simultaneously, a deafening roar erupted, the sound of engines revving, overwhelming our senses that had become accustomed to the quiet darkness. Pure, unadulterated terror gripped us. We reacted instinctively, turning and running as fast as our legs would carry us, the sounds of yelling and the approaching vehicles fueling our flight. By sheer luck, we spotted a small, overgrown hollow in the side of a hill overlooking the path we'd just traversed. It was a natural dugout partially concealed by dense vegetation. We scrambled into it, hoping the darkness and the foliage would provide sufficient cover. We watched, our hearts pounding, as our pursuers rode up to the spot where we'd been standing moments before. There were 4 men, 2 on four-wheelers and 2 on full-size motorcycles. They were yelling at each other, but the distance and the roar of their engines made it impossible to understand what they were saying. We felt relatively safe in our hiding spot, able to whisper softly to each other. Our initial thought was that they might be park rangers. However, we'd never encountered a ranger in this area before, despite our frequent visits. And honestly, we doubted that the local county had the resources or the inclination to patrol these deep woods at night. Besides, these men were riding vehicles that were entirely inappropriate for the paved bike trails, and they were clearly enraged about something. They called out to us, their voices echoing through the woods. "We know you're out there. We can see you. Come on out." We remained silent, deciding to call their bluff rather than risk revealing our location. Then one of the men yelled, his voice laced with menace, "Find them now!" We heard the unmistakable sound of a bottle shattering. Any lingering hope that these were benevolent authorities vanished. We watched them split up, each taking a different path, their headlights cutting through the darkness. One of them had already completed a full circle, passing the point where he'd started. Felt like an eternity before we dared to move. We were frozen with fear, huddled in that dugout, the lights of the vehicles a constant threat. I considered calling for help, but I was too afraid to even open my phone, fearing that even the faintest glow would betray our position. Finally, after waiting for the vehicle lights to reach their farthest point, we summoned the courage to move. We ran, as hard and as fast as we could, through the woods. Since their headlights gave away their positions on the paths, we opted for the denser, more treacherous terrain. Whenever we felt they were getting too close, we ducked down and hide again, our hiding spots becoming progressively less effective as the woods thinned out. The fear I felt during those moments, waiting for one of them to pass by while we were practically exposed, covered only by leaves and sparse vegetation, remains unmatched to this day. Eventually, we emerged from the woods onto the intersection of two main roads, far from where we'd started. We ducked down into a ditch, finally feeling safe enough to make a phone call. I opened my phone and noticed several missed calls from another friend, Connor, who we were supposed to meet up with for our longboarding excursion. I called him back, frantically explaining our situation, asking him to pick us up immediately. Luck, it seemed, was still on our side. Connor hadn't given up on our plans, despite our lack of communication. He was only a few miles away and already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of the two intersecting streets, emphasizing the urgency of our situation. He agreed to speed over, and Jasper and I waited, hidden in the ditch, our anxiety slowly subsiding. Thankfully, Connor arrived before any of those men reappeared. We bolted to his car, yelling for him to drive, and he sped away, our ordeal finally coming to an end. The relief I felt as we were driven home was indescribable. The experience had been harrowing, a terrifying glimpse into the unknown. After explaining everything to Connor, we decided to move on with our night, opting not to call the police. We reasoned that the men would likely be gone by the time an officer arrived, and we'd only be putting ourselves at risk by admitting to breaking the law by using the path so late at night. I still have no idea what happened that night or who those men were. I've heard countless theories from friends and family. A drug deal gone wrong, territorial locals, or something far more sinister. Jasper and I later admitted to each other that when the engines first revved, our minds immediately jumped to a horror movie scenario, chainsaw-wielding serial killers. The truth is, we'll probably never know. Whatever those men thought we saw, whatever prompted their aggressive pursuit, remains a mystery. It's a chilling, unanswered question that lingers in the back of my mind, a reminder of the unpredictable, sometimes terrifying, nature of the world. Ricky's reality. Years ago, during my college days, I was having lunch with a group of friends in a beautiful outdoor plaza on campus. It was a vibrant, bustling space, filled with students enjoying the sunshine and each other's company. As I scanned the area, I noticed a guy I vaguely recognized from one of my classes, sitting alone at a table, seemingly isolated. His name was Ricky, and he always seemed a bit shy, a bit withdrawn. He looked particularly lonely that day, and a pang of empathy prompted me to act. "Hey, you're Ricky, right? From sociology class?" I called out, gesturing towards our table. "Why don't you come join us?" He hesitated for a moment, then, with a shy smile, accepted my invitation. He joined our group, and while he remained relatively quiet, everyone made an effort to include him in the conversation, introducing themselves and making small talk. It was a brief, pleasant interaction, a simple act of kindness, and that, I thought, was that. It was the last interaction I consciously remembered having with Ricky, or because of Ricky until several months later, when a series of events unfolded that would leave me deeply shaken and confused. It was during one of my work shifts. I was on break when I was unexpectedly cornered by a group of 4 guys I barely knew. They were confrontational, their faces etched with anger. "You're being a real jerk to Ricky," one of them said, his voice accusatory, "and it has to stop." I was utterly bewildered. I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. "Who's Ricky?" I asked, my confusion genuine. "Are you sure you have the right person? I don't know what you're talking about." They didn't believe me. Their disbelief was palpable, their anger unwavering. "He said you're leading Ricky on, then blowing him off, then leading him on again with promises. And he's at campus health right now, being evaluated, and it's all your fault for messing with his head. I was terrified, completely overwhelmed by the intensity of their accusation and the utter lack of context. Thankfully, at that moment, my coworker, an older woman named Sarah, came outside and intervened. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice firm and authoritative. One of the guys turned to her and said, "Your friend here has been messing with our friend Ricky, and we're here to make sure that she stops." I seized the opportunity to clarify, my voice trembling slightly. "Ricky from my sociology class last semester? I hardly know the guy. We're talking about the same person, right?" The presence of my coworker seemed to deflate the guy's bravado somewhat. Sarah, clearly angry, threatened to call security and have them all arrested for harassing me. She vouched for my character, stating that she knew me and that I was a good person who would never intentionally hurt someone. She told them they had the wrong person and needed to leave, but I needed to understand. I needed to know what was going on. "Wait," I said, my voice regaining some strength. "I want to know what's happening. I know Ricky. I spoke to him once in my life. What is going on?" The story that unfolded was both bizarre and deeply disturbing. Apparently, that single act of kindness, inviting Ricky to join my friends and me for lunch, had somehow led him to believe that I was in love with him. He'd constructed an elaborate, delusional relationship in his mind, a fantasy that he believed with unwavering conviction. He'd shared this fantasy with his friends, recounting detailed stories of our supposed relationship. And his friends, astonishingly, had never questioned it. They'd believed his lies, never once stopping to consider why Ricky and I were never seen together, why there was no evidence whatsoever of this supposed romance. I wondered, for a moment, if Ricky was intentionally lying, perhaps to create the illusion of having a girlfriend. Maybe, when I didn't reciprocate his imagined affections, he'd simply claimed I dumped him, a convenient cover story. But as I learned more about certain psychological disorders, I came to believe that Ricky genuinely believed his own fantasies. He was living in a delusional world, and when he had a breakdown, apparently triggered by my supposed cruelty, his friends, fueled by his fabricated narrative, had sought me out to exact their misguided revenge. They knew where I worked. That was the most terrifying part. They knew my routine, my location, and I had absolutely no idea any of this was going on. It was a chilling realization, a stark reminder of how easily our lives can be infiltrated by the unseen, the unknown. Did any of those boys ever apologize to me? No. In fact, at least one of them remained convinced that I was lying, even after it became clear that Ricky was mentally unwell, that something was profoundly wrong. At the time, the experience was frightening enough. But years later, it's even more terrifying. The realization that all of this could unfold without my knowledge. The ease with which people can believe utter fabrications, and their unwillingness to admit their mistakes. It's a chilling testament to the fragility of reality and the power of delusion. I'm eternally grateful to my coworker, Sarah, for her intervention, for standing up for me in the face of such unfounded aggression. It was one of the most frightening and confusing moments of my life, and I was constantly on edge afterward, whenever I saw Ricky or one of his friends around campus. I have no idea where Ricky and his friends are today, but I never ever should have invited him over to that lunch. It was a simple act of kindness that spiraled into a terrifying, surreal ordeal, a stark reminder that even the smallest gestures can have unforeseen and potentially dangerous consequences. The altar and the app. This happened about a year ago. I was using Grindr, a social networking app primarily used by gay men, often for casual encounters, but also for dating and forming relationships. I was browsing profiles, looking for someone interesting, someone I might connect with either for a fun night or, ideally, something more substantial. I received a new message from a guy I'll call Brandon. I checked out his profile pictures, read his bio, and found myself intrigued. He seemed attractive, intelligent, and engaging. We started messaging back and forth, and he proved to be a surprisingly good conversationalist, something of a rarity on the app. He was charismatic, witty, and seemed genuinely kind. After a few days of consistent communication, we exchanged numbers. He continued to impress me with his thoughtful messages and easygoing personality. I decided I wanted to meet him in person to see if the chemistry we had online translated to the real world. So, I asked him out on a date. I suggested we grab lattes at my favorite local coffee shop, a casual, public setting that felt safe and comfortable for a first meeting. He enthusiastically agreed, and we set a date. The plan was for me to drive to his place and pick him up. It was around 6 p.m., and I sent him a text message to let him know I was leaving my house. He responded with a playful, "I can't wait to meet you." I smiled, feeling a flutter of anticipation, pleased with his apparent enthusiasm. Then, in the middle of my drive, I received a phone call from him. I answered, expecting a minor change of plans, perhaps a different coffee shop or a slight delay. "Hey, Brandon, what's up?" I said. "Hey," he replied, his voice sounding different than I'd imagined. "Quick change of plans. I'm feeling tired, and I'd rather not go out. Would you be okay with staying at my place? We can watch some shows and order some takeout." My initial reaction was disappointment. I mean, that's not really what I had in mind, I admitted. I'd like to go out and do things on the first date. His response was jarring. "Oh, don't be such a buzzkill," he said, his tone dismissive and slightly aggressive. "Just come over. I won't show you a bad time." As he spoke, a wave of unease washed over me. Something about his voice, his inflection, felt off. Based on our text messages, I'd envisioned him as light-hearted and playful. But over the phone, he sounded rushed, almost frantic. Despite my growing apprehension, I decided to accept his offer. Maybe he was just tired, stressed from work. I didn't want to overreact, to jump to conclusions. I pulled into his driveway, and he greeted me at the door. He looked like his pictures, undeniably handsome. He was wearing stylish glasses, and his dark, straight hair contrasted sharply with his pale skin. When I stepped inside, I was greeted by one of his roommates, who was engrossed in a video game at Dark Souls, I believe, in the living room. Wanting to be polite, I approached the roommate and introduced myself, hoping to make a good impression on Brandon's friends. While I was chatting with his roommate, Brandon called my name, beckoning me to follow him into his bedroom. I politely excused myself and followed him. And that's when I saw it. A scene that looked like it had been ripped straight from a horror movie. Only this was real, unfolding before my very eyes. Candles were lit all around the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And scattered throughout the room were altars. Not just one or two, but several, each adorned with an unsettling array of objects. Ancient-looking figurines, animal bones, jars filled with unidentifiable liquids, and, most disturbingly, a dagger placed next to a cat's skull. I don't remember all the details of each altar, but a few images remain seared into my memory. One altar was on the floor, featuring a glass container filled with a yellowish liquid, surrounded by animal skulls. Another was on a shelf next to his bed, with candles encircling a doll with its eyes sewn shut and its hands missing. It was a bizarre, unsettling collection, a macabre display that sent shivers down my spine. A part of me screamed to get out, to run as fast as I could. But another part of me, perhaps foolishly, tried to rationalize the situation. I didn't know much about occult practices or alternative religions. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, to assume that Brandon had malicious intentions. Plus, I admit, I can be a bit reactive at times, so I decided to stay, to see where this bizarre evening would lead. As I stood there, trying to process the scene before me, I decided to break the tension by asking about the altars. My curiosity piqued despite my growing apprehension. "What are these for?" I asked, gesturing towards the unsettling displays. He replied, his voice evasive, "I'll tell you about them later." It was a strange response, but again, I brushed it off, attributing it to eccentricity. I can be a bit weird myself, so I try to be understanding of others' quirks. Then, I pointed to one of the altars, the one with the doll, and asked, "What's this one about?" His reaction was immediate and jarring. He frowned, his face contorting into a scowl. "Don't touch that," he snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. The sudden shift in his demeanor startled me. I was at least 4 feet away from the altar, nowhere near touching it. Yet, he'd yelled at me as if I were a child misbehaving in church. I was confused, feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I apologized, unsure of what I'd done wrong. And then, just as quickly as his anger had flared, it vanished. His scowl melted into a smile, a genuinely warm, inviting smile. He kindly invited me to sit with him on the couch and watch a show. It was unnerving, this rapid shift in personality. It was as if he were 2 different people, seamlessly switching between them. I was unsure how to process it, so I simply sat down, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. We started talking, discussing our lives, our interests. He was sweet, soft-spoken, much like he'd been over text messages. It felt like a genuine first date, and my nerves began to subside, if only slightly. I started to think that maybe I had been overreacting, that he was just a bit eccentric. Then he turned on his TV. I was still on edge, still wary of his unpredictable behavior. So, I made a suggestion, hoping to introduce a buffer, a sense of normalcy. "Hey, why don't we invite your roommate in to hang out with us?" I asked. His roommate seemed like a perfectly average guy when I'd met him, and I thought his presence might ease the tension, provide a more comfortable atmosphere. But Brandon immediately shot down my suggestion, his personality shifting again. From easygoing to stressed and angry, he started cursing out his roommate, making it abundantly clear that he despised him. The sudden switch was jarring, unsettling. I started to panic again. Then, just as abruptly, he changed the subject, turning his attention back to me. He complimented my appearance, saying he found me very attractive. As he spoke, his fingers began to graze my thighs, a touch that felt intrusive and unwelcome. I needed a moment to collect myself, to process this escalating series of bizarre events. So, I excused myself, saying I needed to get some water. As I stood up, he immediately slapped my butt, a gesture that was both disrespectful and unwanted. "Don't take too long," he said, his tone playful but with an underlying edge. I walked out of the room, closing the door behind me, my heart pounding. I headed for the kitchen, hoping to catch his roommate on the way and perhaps glean some information about Brandon's behavior. But the roommate was asleep on the living room couch, oblivious to the unfolding drama. I went to the cabinets searching for a glass. My mind raced. I considered simply walking out, driving away, escaping this increasingly unsettling situation. But paranoia started to creep in. He had all those altars, those strange objects. He hadn't explained their purpose. I'd seen enough horror movies about the occult to know that messing with such things could have unpredictable consequences. Who was to say this guy wasn't capable of putting some kind of voodoo curse on me? Yes, it was a dramatic thought, perhaps even irrational. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of being in the presence of something unnatural. So, I grabbed a glass of water and cautiously returned to his room. When I walked back in, I saw him sitting on the couch, his legs crossed, his eyes closed. As I approached, I noticed his mouth moving, but I couldn't hear any sound. It was incredibly unnerving. I called his name, but he didn't respond. Strange. I called his name a second time, and he finally opened his eyes, uncrossed his legs, and turned his attention back to the television, without acknowledging his bizarre behavior. What had he been doing? Chanting? Praying? Something else entirely? I was increasingly worried, but I tried to maintain my composure. I didn't want to do anything to upset him, to trigger another outburst. I sat down next to him on the couch and we resumed talking. He was completely normal again, unnervingly so. It was as if the previous incidents had never happened. It felt like I was interacting with a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, except Brandon could switch between his personalities seamlessly, without warning. I knew I needed to leave, but I was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't confront him, he might lash out. But I also couldn't stay. He was clearly unstable. I tried to devise a plan, some way to escape without provoking him. Then he got up to grab his phone, and, in a moment of reckless impulsivity, I decided to try something. I decided to dish out some of the same treatment he'd given me. I reached out and grabbed his butt, a cheeky, playful gesture. Maybe it would ease the tension, I thought. Maybe he'd appreciate it, and it would make him less aggressive. His reaction was immediate and violent. He spun around, swatting my hand away, and lunged at me. His hands were curled into fists, and he swung one towards my face. His fist stopped inches from my cheek, frozen mid-punch. In that moment, I saw his eyes. They were wide open, his expression cold, emotionless. He was right in my face, his presence menacing, overwhelming. My heart was beating so fast, I felt like I was on the verge of a panic attack. Then he unfurled his fist, placed his hands on either side of my face, and started to squeeze. "You're just so cute," he said, his voice dripping with a patronizing tone, as if he were talking to a dog. He pulled me in and forced a kiss on me. It was a kiss I absolutely did not want, but I was paralyzed, unable to resist. I felt disgusted, violated, kissing someone who had just threatened me with physical violence. He slowly pulled away, gave me another unsettlingly sweet smile, and sat back down, resuming his position in front of the television, as if nothing had happened. That was it. I was done. His behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, unpredictable. His room was a shrine to some unknown, unsettling practice. He was clearly associated with the occult, and, frankly, he was terrifying me. I decided I'd rather deal with the potential consequences of his voodoo altars later than remain in his presence any longer. I snapped myself out of my anxiety-induced trance, stood up, and announced that I was starting to feel sick and needed to go home. He got angry, trying to convince me to stay the night, his voice taking on that sharp, aggressive edge again. But I stood my ground, mustering all my courage, and insisted that it was time for me to leave. He begrudgingly relented, but it was clear that my decision had upset him. I didn't care. I said my goodbyes, feigning a promise to text him later, and practically ran out of the house. I got in my car and drove home, shaking, sweating, my mind racing. I felt a wave of relief at escaping that unsettling situation, but also a lingering fear that he might try to retaliate in some way. The uncertainty of it all was what truly disturbed me. Thankfully, no actual harm came to me. I blocked Brandon's number, as well as his Grindr profile. I haven't heard from him since. But even now, I still harbor a fear that he might try to find me, to seek some kind of twisted revenge. It's a lingering anxiety, a constant reminder of that bizarre, terrifying night and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The static on Channel Zero. The static began subtly, a faint, almost imperceptible hiss that overlaid the crisp, clear audio of the late-night talk radio show Detective Miles Corbin, was listening to. It was 2:37 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I was driving my unmarked Ford Taurus down a deserted stretch of Route 60, heading back to the precinct after a fruitless stakeout. I'd been a detective with the Phoenix PD for 12 years, long enough to have seen my share of strange things, unsettling things, things that defied easy explanation. But this was different. The static grew louder, evolving into a crackling, white noise roar that drowned out the radio host's voice. I reached for the dial, trying to find another station, but every frequency was the same, pure, unadulterated static. Then I heard it, my name, whispered through the static, a soft, almost intimate voice that seemed to come from inside my own head. Miles. My hand froze on the dial. My blood ran cold. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there, just the empty back seat, bathed in the faint, red glow of the dashboard lights. The road ahead was empty, a ribbon of black asphalt stretching endlessly into the Arizona desert. The only illumination came from my headlights, cutting twin swaths through the darkness, and the pale, ethereal light of the moon. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The last sign of civilization had been a dusty, dilapidated gas station, miles back. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Miles, listen." I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest, the car swerving slightly before coming to a stop on the shoulder of the road. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. I grabbed my phone, intending to call dispatch, to report. What? A strange voice on the radio? They'd laughed me off the line. The phone screen displayed a single bar of signal. I tried to dial, but the call wouldn't go through. Then, I noticed something else. A notification, a text message. From my own number. My hands trembled as I opened the message. It was short, cryptic, and terrifying. "Don't stop." I stared at the message, my mind reeling. How could I have sent a text message to myself? And what did it mean? Don't stop. Don't stop. What? Driving? Breathing? Living? The static on the radio intensified, a deafening roar that filled the car. Through the white noise, I could hear the whisper again, more urgent now, laced with a hint of panic. "Miles, behind you." My blood turned to ice. I slowly turned my head, peering into the rearview mirror, expecting to see some monstrous figure, some terrifying apparition. First, I saw nothing, just the empty road, stretching behind me into the darkness. Then, in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared. They were faint at first, just two tiny pinpricks of light, but they were growing rapidly, approaching at an alarming speed. I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The engine roared, the tires spun briefly on the gravel shoulder, and then I was back on the road, speeding away from the approaching headlights. My phone buzzed again. Another text message. From my own number. Faster. I glanced at the speedometer. 80 miles per hour. 90 miles per hour. 100 miles per hour. The car was vibrating, the engine screaming in protest, but I pushed it harder, faster. The headlights in my rearview mirror were still gaining on me. I couldn't make out the make or model of the vehicle, just two blinding white orbs that seemed to consume the darkness. The static on the radio changed pitch, becoming a high-pitched whine, a piercing sound that made my teeth ache. Through the whine, I could hear fragments of words, distorted and fragmented, like a broken record. "Coming? Can't hide, find you." My hands were slick with sweat, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The road ahead was a blur, the desert landscape rushing past in a streak of muted colors. I risked another glance at the rearview mirror. The headlights were closer now, close enough that I could feel their heat, their intensity. My phone buzzed again. "Turn right." Now, I looked ahead, my eyes scanning the darkness. There was no road, no intersection, nothing but desert. Turn right? Into that? I'd be driving straight into a ditch, flipping the car, killing myself. The headlights behind me flared, blindingly bright. The pursuing vehicle was right on my tail, its engine a deafening roar. I had a split second to decide. Trust the message or trust my own eyes. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The car careened off the road, bouncing violently as it hit the uneven terrain. I fought to maintain control, my body thrown from side to side, my head snapping back against the headrest. I was expecting to crash, to feel the jarring impact of metal against rock, the shattering of glass, the crushing weight of the car rolling over me. But it didn't happen. Instead, the car continued to move, bumping and jolting, but still upright, still under my control. I looked around, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. I was on a dirt road, a narrow, winding track that I could swear hadn't been there a moment ago. In my rearview mirror, I saw the headlights of the pursuing vehicle shoot past the turnoff, continuing down the highway, disappearing into the distance. They hadn't followed me. I slowed the car to a stop, my body trembling, my heart still racing. I checked my phone. The signal was gone. The screen was blank. The radio was silent. No static. No whispers, just the faint hum of the engine. I sat there for a long moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My phone buzzed again. Another text message. From my own number. Get out. Walk 100 paces north. Bring the phone. I stared at the message, my mind reeling. Get out? Walk? Into the desert? In the middle of the night? It was insane. It was suicidal. But the alternative was to go back to the highway, to face whatever had been chasing me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I grabbed my flashlight, checked my service weapon, and got out of the car. The desert night was cold, the air crisp and clear. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint crunch of my boots on the gravel. I started walking north, counting my steps, my flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The landscape was desolate, barren, a vast expanse of sand, rock, and scrub brush. The moon cast long, eerie shadows, making the familiar shapes of cacti and Joshua trees seem alien and menacing. 50 paces, 60, 70. I kept walking, my eyes scanning the darkness, my senses on high alert. 80, 90, 95. I was nearing the end of the prescribed distance. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, my flashlight beam sweeping across the empty landscape. Nothing. Then I saw it. A small, wooden cross, stuck in the ground, almost hidden by a cluster of rocks. 100 paces. Exactly. I approached the cross cautiously, my flashlight beam focused on it. It was old, weathered, the wood cracked and faded. A small, tarnished metal plate was nailed to it, bearing an inscription that was almost illegible. I knelt down, bringing the flashlight closer, trying to decipher the words. Here lies David, lost to the highway. The rest of the inscription was obscured by dirt and decay. David, another victim, another driver who had encountered. What? The same thing that had chased me? The same voice that had whispered my name? My phone buzzed again. Another text message. But this time it wasn't from my own number. It was from David. The message was a single word. Run. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping frantically across the desert, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what was coming. Then I heard it. A low, humming sound, coming from the direction of the highway. It was growing louder, closer, accompanied by the faint glow of headlights. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran back towards my car, my boots pounding on the hard-packed earth, my lungs burning, my heart racing. I could hear the engine now, a powerful, throaty roar that echoed through the silent desert. It was gaining on me, fast. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. I threw open the door, scrambled inside, and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. I started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and spun the tires, sending a spray of gravel and dust into the air. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I drove all night, not stopping until I reached the next town, until I saw the familiar glow of streetlights and the reassuring presence of other people. I abandoned my car at a gas station, leaving the keys in the ignition. I took a bus to the next city, then another and another, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that deserted stretch of Route 60. I threw away my phone, got a new number, a new identity. I tried to forget what had happened, to dismiss it as a hallucination, a nightmare, a product of stress and exhaustion. But I couldn't. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. And I knew that somewhere out there, on that lonely stretch of highway, something was waiting. Waiting for the next driver. Waiting for the next victim. Waiting to whisper their name through the static. I started writing everything down, documenting my experience, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a pattern, a reason. I researched Route 60, looking for similar stories, for other reports of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances. I found them, dozens of them. Drivers reporting strange lights, phantom vehicles, disembodied voices on the radio, text messages from their own numbers, cars malfunctioning, electronics failing, and always the static that preceded the terror, the static that carried the whispers, the static that was a warning. I realized, with a growing sense of horror, that I wasn't just a victim. I was a survivor. Someone or something had tried to help me, to warn me, to guide me to safety. The messages, the voice, David. But who was David? And what was the creature on the highway? And why did it want me? I started carrying a small, handheld recorder with me at all times, hoping to capture the voice, the static, any evidence that could prove I wasn't crazy. I started avoiding driving at night, sticking to well-lit city streets, avoiding highways altogether. But the fear, the paranoia, remained. I knew it was still out there, waiting. One evening, several months after my escape, I was walking home from work when my new phone buzzed. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I slowly pulled the phone out of my pocket, my hands trembling. It was a text message from an unknown number. My breath caught in my chest. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Should I open it? Should I ignore it? Curiosity and a morbid sense of dread won out. I opened the message. It was a single sentence. They're coming for you, Miles. Channel 0. Channel 0. What did that mean? I frantically searched the internet, typing in Channel 0, Route 60, static, highway disappearances. I found nothing, just the usual conspiracy theories, urban legends, and ghost stories. Then, I stumbled upon a small, obscure online forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena, paranormal encounters, and radio anomalies. And there I found it, a thread titled, The Static on Channel 0 Route 60. I clicked on the thread, my heart pounding. The first post was from a user named Desert Dreamer. Has anyone else experienced the static on Route 60? It starts around mile marker 147, and it gets worse the closer you get to Miller's Curve. I heard voices, whispers, and then I saw it. A pair of headlights coming up behind me fast. Too fast. I floored it, but they kept gaining. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from my own number. It said, "Turn left." There was no road, just desert. But I turned anyway, and the headlights, they just kept going. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't turned. My blood ran cold. It was my story, almost exactly. I scrolled through the thread, reading other posts, other accounts. I heard my name, whispered through the static. It was terrifying. My car's electronics went haywire. The radio, the GPS, the phone, all dead. I saw a figure, standing by the side of the road. It had no face. The headlights, they were blinding. They followed me for miles. I got a text message from myself. It saved my life. Dozens of stories, all similar, all pointing to the same terrifying conclusion. Something was out there on Route 60. Something that used the static, that used technology to hunt its prey. And something or someone was trying to help. The last post in the thread was from a user named David_1987. I wasn't so lucky. I didn't turn. I didn't listen. They got me, but I left a warning. Across. Mile marker 152. If you see it, run. Don't stop. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't listen to the voices. They lie. David, the cross in the desert. It all connected. But who was he? And how did he know? I knew I had to go back. I had to return to Route 60 to find that cross, to understand what had happened to David, and to find a way to stop whatever was out there. I knew it was dangerous, reckless, possibly suicidal, but I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't live with the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that others might suffer the same fate. Ipektipe, taking everything I thought I might need. My recorder, a flashlight, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and my service weapon, a Glock 19 I had kept from my days on the force. I also took a small, handheld radio, one that operated on a different frequency than cell phones, hoping it might be less susceptible to the static. I drove back to Arizona, back to Route 60. It was late afternoon when I reached the stretch of highway where I had experienced the terror. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. I drove slowly, scanning the roadside, looking for any sign of the cross. Mile marker 147, 148, 149. The static started. Faint at first, a subtle hissing in the background, but growing steadily louder, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. 150, 151. Then I saw it. A small, wooden cross, standing on the shoulder of the road, almost hidden by a cluster of rocks. Mile marker 152. I pulled over, my car facing away from the curve, my engine running. I grabbed my recorder and turned it on. The static was deafening now, a roaring white noise that filled the car. I got out, my weapon drawn, my flashlight in my other hand. I approached the cross cautiously, my senses on high alert. The air grew colder. The metallic scent I remembered, the scent of the server room and of my own death that never happened, filled my nostrils. I reached the cross. I knelt down, examining it closely. It was old, weathered, the wood cracked and faded. The inscription was barely legible. Here lies David Marshall, lost to the highway, remembered. I reached out and touched the cross. A jolt of static electricity shot through my hand, making me recoil. Then I heard it, the whisper. But this time it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from everywhere. Miles. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the desert, searching for the source of the voice. Nothing. Then I saw them. Headlights. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Emerging from the darkness. From all directions. Converging on my position. They were moving fast. Too fast. Their engines roaring. Their lights blinding. I was surrounded. Trapped. I raised my weapon, my finger on the trigger, but I knew it was useless. There were too many of them. I couldn't fight them all. The headlights were closing in, forming a tight circle around me, blinding me with their intensity. The static was deafening, a cacophony of whispers and screams and distorted voices. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. This was it. This was the end. Then a new sound, a different sound, a clear, crisp, human voice, cutting through the static, through the roar of the engines. Miles, get down. I opened my eyes, squinting against the glare. I saw a figure standing on the hood of my car, silhouetted against the headlights. It was a woman, tall and slender, holding a device, something that looked like a modified radio antenna, emitting a pulsing blue light. The woman raised the device, pointing it towards the approaching vehicles. A wave of energy, visible as a shimmering distortion in the air, emanated from the antenna, washing over the headlights. The vehicles flickered. Their forms wavered, distorted, like images on a broken television screen. The roaring engines sputtered, died. The headlights dimmed, flickered, then went out. The static ceased. Silence. I lowered my weapon, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The woman jumped down from the hood of my car, approaching me cautiously. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm and reassuring. I nodded slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. Who are you?" I asked. She smiled, a small, sad smile. "My name is Sarah," she said, "and I'm David's sister. David, the man who had left the warning, the man who had been lost to the highway. I've been tracking this thing for years," Sarah continued. "Ever since my brother disappeared, I've been trying to find a way to stop it." She gestured towards the device she was holding. "This is a frequency disruptor. It interferes with the energy that powers the vehicles, the projections." "Projections?" I asked, confused. "They're not real cars," Sarah explained. "They're manifestations, projections of fear, of regret, of lost souls, created by the entity that lurks on this highway." "The collector," I said, remembering the words of the voice on the phone. Sarah nodded. That's one name for it. It's been here for a long time, feeding on the negative energy, on the tragedies that have occurred on this road. And the static? I asked. The whispers. It's a lure, Sarah said. A way to draw people in, to disorient them, to make them vulnerable. And the messages? I asked. The warnings. Those are residual echoes, Sarah explained. Fragments of past victims trying to help, to warn others. Like my brother. It all made sense now. The impossible physics, the shifting realities, the whispers, the static, the messages. It was all connected. We need to destroy it, I said, my voice firm. We need to end this. Sarah nodded. I know, but it's not easy. It's powerful, and it's adaptable. She looked out at the dark desert, her expression grim. We need to find its source, she said. Its anchor, the place where it's strongest. Miller's Curve, I said, suddenly remembering the detail from my initial encounter. And the hitchhiker. That's where I first heard the whispers, where the static was strongest. And it's a place with a history. Sarah nodded. Then that's where we go. We got into my car, Sarah taking the passenger seat, her frequency disruptor resting on her lap. We drove towards Miller's Curve, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The static returned, faint at first, but growing steadily louder as we approached the curve. The radio, which had been silent since my encounter with the vehicles, suddenly crackled to life, emitting a chorus of whispers, screams, and distorted voices. Sarah turned on the frequency disruptor. The blue light pulsed, and the static lessened, but it didn't disappear completely. It's stronger here, she said, her voice tight. Much stronger. We reached Miller's Curve. The road twisted sharply, hugging the edge of a steep embankment. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of decay and that metallic tang. We got out of the car, our weapons drawn, my Glock 19 and Sarah's disruptor. The silence, broken only by the faint hum of the disruptor, was unnerving. Then we saw it, a swirling vortex of darkness, coalescing in the center of the road, just at the apex of the curve. It was larger than before, more powerful, more defined. The figure of the Shadow Man began to emerge from the darkness, its form flickering, wavering, but undeniably present. But this time it wasn't alone. Standing beside it, shrouded in shadow, was another figure, tall, thin, with an outstretched arm. The herder. Two of them, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with dread. The Shadow Man spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of lost souls. You cannot stop us, it hissed. We are Legion. The herder figure remained silent, its arms still outstretched, pointing, not at us, but at the Shadow Man. We know your weakness, I shouted, my voice echoing through the night. We know how to destroy you. The Shadow Man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that made my skin crawl. You know nothing, it whispered. Sarah raised the frequency disruptor, aiming it at the Shadow Man. The blue light pulsed faster, brighter. The Shadow Man recoiled, its form flickering violently. It emitted a high-pitched shriek, a sound of pure agony. But the herder figure, it didn't move. It didn't react. It just stood there, its arms still outstretched, pointing. Then I understood. The herder wasn't protecting the Shadow Man. It was guiding us. It was showing us its weakness, the outstretched arm, the twisted, broken arm. It wasn't pointing at the Shadow Man. It was pointing at itself. Sarah, I shouted, my voice urgent. The herder. Aim for the herder. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with confusion. But she trusted me. She shifted her aim, pointing the frequency disruptor at the tall, dark figure standing beside the Shadow Man. The blue light intensified, bathing the herder in its glow. The figure wavered. His form flickered, distorted, like a mirage shimmering in the heat. Then it screamed, not a scream of pain, but a scream of release, a scream of liberation. The figure's form began to unravel, to dissolve, to break apart into swirling shadows, into fragments of darkness. And as it dissolved, the Shadow Man screamed too. A chorus of screams, a cacophony of agony and despair. His form, which had been flickering before, now began to collapse in on itself, shrinking, twisting, contorting. The darkness that surrounded it dissipated, revealing nothing, just empty space. The static ceased, the whispers faded, the metallic scent vanished. The silence returned, profound and absolute. The herder was gone. The Shadow Man was gone. Sarah lowered the frequency disruptor, her body trembling, her face pale. What was that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse, "but I think we freed it." We stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the figures had been, trying to comprehend what had just happened. We had faced the darkness, and we had won. But we had also learned a terrible truth. The Shadow Man hadn't been the true source of the terror. It had been a manifestation, a projection, a puppet. The herder, the figure with the outstretched arm, had been the key. A victim, trapped, forced to serve the darkness, to lure others to their doom. And we had freed it. We had broken the cycle. We drove away from Miller's Curve, leaving the darkness behind. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the desert landscape. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We had shared an experience that had changed us forever, an experience that had bound us together in a way that words could not express. We knew the world was a different place now. The darkness was still out there, lurking in the shadows, in the between spaces. But we also knew that there was hope, that even in the darkest of nights, there was always a chance for light, for freedom, for redemption. We had faced the Shadow Man and we had survived, and that, we realized, was all that mattered. But we also knew that our journey wasn't over. There were other roads, other curves, other figures waiting in the fog. And we would be ready. We would keep watching. We would keep listening. And we would keep fighting. Because some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Some silences needed to be broken, no matter how terrifying they might seem. The static, we were sure, would return. But we were prepared. Neighbors from the netherworld. Everyone has that one set of neighbors they love to despise, the ones who seem to exist solely to disrupt the peace and tranquility of the neighborhood. They're the ones who throw wild parties that rage until the early hours, scatter their trash with reckless abandon, and borrow your belongings with no intention of returning them. I've had my fair share of bad neighbors, but the year of hell these particular neighbors inflicted upon my family surpassed anything I could have imagined. It's a story filled with so much chaos and disruption that it's difficult to condense it all, but I'll do my best. The setting: a house directly across the street from ours, a rental property that would become the epicenter of our neighborhood nightmare. We knew the owner of the house, a kind woman named Susan, who would later provide us with valuable insights into the tenants from hell. The first ominous sign appeared when they moved in. They drove their moving truck onto the driveway, a perfectly normal action, but then proceeded to park a rather expensive-looking Lexus on the lawn. It was a clear indication of the type of people we were dealing with, a blatant disregard for basic property etiquette. Parking cars on the lawn became a regular occurrence, eventually killing the grass and creating an unsightly eyesore. Another red flag was the sheer number of people who seemed to come and go from the house. It was impossible to determine the exact number of residents, but the regular cast of characters included an overweight blonde woman, whom I'll call Brenda, a somewhat more presentable brunette with glasses, who I'll name Carol, a hideous, rat-like young man with a punk aesthetic, who we'll refer to as Spike, a teenage girl, thin and gaunt, who looked disturbingly like she was involved in prostitution, who I'll call Tiffany, and two small toddlers, a boy and a girl whose names I never learned. This motley crew quickly established themselves as the loudest, most disruptive force in the neighborhood. Their days and nights were filled with seemingly endless parties and ear-splitting arguments. They possessed the foulest mouths imaginable, spewing profanities with a frequency that was shocking, even to a teenager like myself. Even the youngest child could be heard uttering words that no child should ever know, let alone repeat. Even during the daylight hours, we couldn't open our windows without being subjected to the vulgar music blasting from their open garage door, where one of the teenagers, usually Spike, would be working on a dented, beat-up car. It was a constant assault on our senses. A particularly infuriating aspect of their existence was the neglect of the two small toddlers. They were frequently left outside, unsupervised, in the front yard, for hours on end. These people were clearly living on welfare and other government assistance programs, their lifestyle a stark contrast to the hardworking families in our neighborhood. The most annoying thing, however, began to occur during their first full month of residence. They started asking to borrow things. Carol, the brunette, was usually the one who'd show up at our door, often with a child on her hip and another trailing behind her. First, the requests were relatively innocuous: sugar, eggs, things you might expect a neighbor to borrow in a pinch. My mother, Linda, being the kind and generous soul she is, was reluctant to refuse them. But the requests escalated, becoming increasingly bizarre and demanding. They asked for diapers, an electric griddle, which, surprisingly, they did return, and on one occasion, they asked if they could charge their phone for a while, claiming their electricity had been shut off due to unpaid bills, a situation that would become a recurring theme. The true highlight of this saga, however, was yet to come. All of the preceding annoyances paled in comparison to what happened next. It was a scorching summer day, the kind of heat that makes you feel sluggish and drained, slowing your movements and clouding your thoughts. I happened to glance out the window, and what I saw sent a surge of horror through me. I witnessed Tiffany, the teenage girl, dragging the screaming toddler boy into the house after he'd been running around outside unsupervised. She slammed the mesh screen door shut behind her, but I could still see her silhouette through the thin screen. And then I saw it. She began kicking the child, repeatedly, her small frame filled with a rage that was both shocking and disturbing. She was yelling at him, calling him all sorts of vile names, her words muffled but still audible through the closed door. I immediately alerted my mother, my voice filled with alarm. She rushed outside, her face a mask of fury, and yelled at Tiffany to stop, threatening to call the police. Tiffany, unfazed, responded with a string of curses, calling my mother nosy and other, more offensive names. She then slammed the main door shut, cutting off the visual but not the sound of the ongoing abuse. My mother, her anger reaching a boiling point, immediately called Child Protective Services, reporting the incident with a mixture of outrage and despair. Shortly thereafter, Brenda, the overweight blonde, along with Spike, her gangly son, and Tiffany, the violent teenager, were pounding on our door, their faces contorted with rage. They were thirsting for confrontation, their anger palpable. My mother, maintaining a remarkable level of composure, slowly drew up the blinds and cracked open the window, making it clear that she wouldn't open the door. Brenda launched into a tirade, yelling at my mother for interfering in their family business, demanding that she F off and mind her own affairs. The verbal assault continued for nearly half an hour, a relentless barrage of curses and threats. My mother, finally reaching her limit, calmly explained that as long as she was forced to witness such cruelty and hear such foul language, she would not stay out of their business. She warned them that if they didn't leave her property immediately, she would call the police. She shut the window and closed the blinds, cutting off the visual, but the sounds of their rage still echoed through the house. Not long after, the police were called again, this time by other neighbors who had also witnessed the family's disturbing behavior. The family was finally issued a warning and an eviction date, but even that didn't stop them. They remained in the house for weeks after their water and power had been shut off, living in squalor, defying the eviction order. When they finally realized that they had to leave or face arrest, they unleashed their fury on the house itself. They did everything in their power to destroy and deface the property. Susan, the landlady, was in tears as she gave my mother a tour of the now vacant house. Windows had been smashed, sinks ripped out and tossed into the yard, walls riddled with holes and covered in vulgar graffiti. The toilets were backed up with human waste, a disgusting testament to their spiteful destruction. Anything they couldn't take with them, they destroyed. It's been some time since that nightmare family moved out, and a new family has since moved into the house. But the memory remains fresh, a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity and the potential for chaos that can lurk just across the street. I sincerely hope no one ever has to endure the kind of neighborly hell we experienced. Jack's surgical obsession. When I was around 13 or 14, a new student, whom I'll call Jack, arrived at my middle school. Our school was fairly large, situated in a densely populated neighborhood, so the arrival of new students wasn't an uncommon occurrence. Typically, no one made a big deal out of it, but Jack was different. He was noticeably shy, almost painfully so, and he seemed to radiate an aura of awkwardness, of not quite fitting in. I felt a pang of sympathy for him, remembering my own experiences with feeling out of place. So, I decided to approach him, to introduce myself and offer a friendly welcome, a small gesture to ease his transition into a new environment. Little did I know, this seemingly innocuous act of kindness would lead to a series of increasingly bizarre and unsettling encounters. Jack was unusually tall for his age, with a large, almost imposing frame. At first, he didn't come across as creepy, just awkward and a bit socially inept. But then again, awkwardness is practically a defining characteristic of hormone-addled preteens, so his behavior didn't immediately raise any red flags. I don't recall the specifics of our initial conversations, the mundane small talk that typically accompanies new acquaintances. But I do remember that he made a concerted effort to seek me out, to say hello to me, and specifically me. Even if I was surrounded by a group of friends, he'd address me by name, a subtle but noticeable distinction. Looking back, I suspect he might have had a crush on me, but at the time, I was completely oblivious to any romantic overtures. I wasn't particularly interested in boys, and his behavior simply registered as slightly odd, but not necessarily alarming. Things started to get weird during an art class assignment. Our teacher, Mrs. Davis, instructed us to decorate the covers of our sketch pads with something that represented our passions, our interests, something that truly resonated with us. Most of my classmates chose typical teenage themes, favorite bands, sports teams, video game characters. My own cover probably featured some angsty band I was listening to at the time. Jack's cover, however, was different. It was a photograph of an open-heart surgery. Not an illustration, not a stylized depiction, but an actual graphic photograph of a human heart, exposed and vulnerable during a surgical procedure. The teacher, along with everyone else who saw it, was understandably disturbed. It was a jarring, unsettling image, completely out of place in a middle school art class. Mrs. Davis likely had a private conversation with him about his choice, but as far as I remember, he was allowed to keep the image on his sketchpad, despite its graphic nature. Later, I approached Jack, my curiosity piqued, and asked him why he'd chosen that particular image. He explained, with a disconcerting level of enthusiasm, that he was deeply fascinated by cardiology, that he spent hours watching surgery videos online, and that he aspired to study it in college. It was still a strange choice, especially the graphic nature of the image, but his explanation provided a semblance of context, a glimpse into his unusual passion. Or so I thought. In the weeks that followed, Jack's behavior became increasingly erratic and unsettling. He started claiming that he was working a part-time internship at a local hospital, a position he'd supposedly secured through his grandmother, who he claimed was a nurse there. He boasted about his access to the medical world, his supposed involvement in procedures that were far beyond the scope of any 13-year-old. He even went so far as to wear scrubs to school one day, a blatant attempt to bolster his fabricated narrative. It was obviously a lie. No hospital in their right mind would allow a 13-year-old to participate in any medical capacity, let alone surgical procedures. It was a preposterous claim, but Jack seemed to believe it, or at the very least, he believed that I would believe it. I was constantly trying to assess what was going on inside his mind. One day, he asked me if I wanted to see some of the tools they used at the hospital. Partly out of morbid curiosity and partly out of a growing fear of what might happen if I didn't play along. Agreed. And, to my utter astonishment, he actually brought a collection of medical instruments to school. Scalpels, scissors, forceps. The kid had a complete dissection kit in his backpack. I have no idea where he obtained these items. Did he purchase them? Did he steal them from his grandmother, assuming she actually was a nurse? I leaned towards the latter explanation, but the truth remained elusive. The sheer audacity of bringing these potentially dangerous instruments to school, of all places, was staggering. I still don't understand his rationale. Perhaps he thought it was his only opportunity to impress me with his supposed medical expertise, since we never interacted outside of school. In retrospect, I'm incredibly grateful that we didn't spend time together outside of school. I, of course, pretended to be impressed, feigning interest in his tools and his fabricated stories. But inside, I was terrified. I immediately reported the incident to the principal, my fear outweighing any loyalty I might have felt towards Jack. The principal, understandably alarmed, contacted Jack's grandmother, who was just as shocked and bewildered as everyone else to learn of her grandson's actions. I don't know the specifics of the disciplinary measures taken, but as far as I remember, Jack faced minimal consequences. It was near the end of the school year, and shortly thereafter, I moved to a different school for unrelated reasons, effectively ending my interactions with him. Thankfully, he never attempted to harm me or anyone else, as far as I know. I believe he genuinely thought it was acceptable, even impressive, to bring a collection of potential weapons to school. But I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I'd angered him, if I hadn't pretended to go along with his delusional world. He was notoriously volatile, and I consider myself fortunate to have escaped his orbit unscathed. I suspect he was struggling with mental illness. I know he was dealing with depression because I was 2 at the time and we briefly discussed it. But, looking back, it's clear he was also delusional, living in a fabricated reality that bore little resemblance to the truth. This all happened almost a decade ago, a time when mental health issues were often stigmatized and swept under the rug. The school likely didn't investigate the situation thoroughly, or provide Jack and his family with the support and resources they needed. It's a sad reality, a reflection of a societal failure to address mental health with the seriousness it deserves. So, yeah, creepy kid from middle school. I sincerely hope you're doing better now, but I'll never forget our interactions, and not in a good way. It was a chilling, unsettling experience, a reminder of the hidden struggles that can lurk beneath the surface, and the potential dangers of unchecked delusion. The heavy breather. A few days ago, I was walking downtown during the mid-afternoon, enjoying a rare break in my hectic work schedule. It was a busy city street, crowded with pedestrians, the usual hustle and bustle of urban life. As I walked, I became aware of a presence behind me. It wasn't a visual awareness, but rather a sense, a feeling of being followed. Again, it's a busy street, so I didn't pay it much mind, but this man stayed directly behind me for several blocks. I could hear his breathing, which was becoming increasingly ragged and coarse. It was heavy, labored breathing, growing more pronounced with each step. I didn't want to turn around to make eye contact. I didn't want to acknowledge his presence, to give him any indication that I was aware of him. But I could feel him following me, his presence a palpable weight on my back. Then I heard him speak. "Honey," he said, his voice raspy and close. "If you don't slow down, I'll never catch up to you." Terror surged through me. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, ready to confront him, to demand an explanation. He was big, imposing, at least a foot taller than me, and on his chest, I saw it a sticky paper ID tag, the kind used for visitors or patients. It was from a mental hospital. A mental patient had been following me for blocks, his breathing heavy and labored, and he was now trying to get me to slow down. I turned away, immediately crossing the street, putting as much distance as possible between us. I didn't look back, but I didn't hear him following me any further. He seemed to have stopped his pursuit at that point. The incident left me deeply shaken, my heart pounding, my mind racing. That's how the story would be told if I were that woman. But I'm not. I'm the guy. And this is the story of how I accidentally became the subject of someone else's let's not meet story. A terrifying misunderstanding born from a series of unfortunate coincidences. I had been out of the office for over a week, battling a nasty bout of bronchitis that had completely knocked me off my feet. My girlfriend, bless her heart, had nursed me back to health, patiently tending to my needs. And now, she was the one who was sick, stuck at home, feeling miserable. This was my first day back at work, and I felt terrible leaving her. I wanted to do something nice for her, a small gesture to show my appreciation and lift her spirits. She's an avid gamer, a dedicated player of The Elder Scrolls Online. The game had recently released a new expansion, which included a new character class she was eager to try. But she'd put off purchasing the expansion, focusing on taking care of me during my illness. So I decided to surprise her. On my lunch break, I'd go to the nearest GameStop and buy her the digital code for the expansion. My lunch break arrived, and I set off. Now, here's the thing. The local GameStop and my office building are located on opposite sides of a very large, steep hill. And remember, I was still recovering from bronchitis. I reached the GameStop, purchased the digital code, and texted her a picture of it, along with a joking message. "You better wait until I get home to play this, or I'll never catch up." Then, I started the arduous trek back to the office, heading uphill. And that's when the combination of heat, humidity, and my still recovering lungs began to take its toll. I started breathing heavily, audibly wheezing with each step. And as fate would have it, I happened to be walking the exact same path as a woman who was a short distance ahead of me. I'd now been walking behind her for a couple of blocks, my heavy breathing, I'm sure, becoming increasingly noticeable. Two important details about me. First, I'm a tech enthusiast. I wear a smartwatch, Bluetooth earbuds, the whole 9 yards. Second, I'm a big guy, 6'2", 240 pounds. A former college athlete who still maintains a regular workout routine. I'm a scary-looking individual. I am actually a gentle giant, but I'm fully aware that, in the wrong context, I could be perceived as intimidating. So, what's the tech relevance? Smartwatch, Bluetooth earbuds. My girlfriend called me. I tapped on my smartwatch to answer the call, without ever taking my phone out of my pocket. The call was automatically routed to my Bluetooth earbuds. My girlfriend, hearing the audible chime on her end, indicating that I'd answered, immediately launched into an excited account of how she couldn't wait and had already started playing the new expansion without me. And that's when I, jokingly, said, "Honey, if you don't slow down, I'll never catch up." The woman ahead of me, understandably, freaked out. She whipped around, her eyes wide with fear, and that's when I realized, with a sickening jolt of understanding, that she thought I was talking to her. I wasn't holding a phone. I'd been following her for blocks, audibly wheezing, and I just uttered a phrase that, in her context, sounded incredibly threatening. Then, I realized something else. Remember how I said it was my first day back at work? I was still feeling the effects of the bronchitis, and, in my weakened state, I'd forgotten my work ID at home. I now work in a highly secure government building, the kind of place that doesn't just let you in, even if all the security guards know your face from years of employment. No ID, no entry. You have to undergo a thorough security screening, let's just call it an ear cavity search level screening, and wait for human resources to verify your employment status. But once you've endured your morning humiliation, they do provide you with a temporary visitor badge, a sticky paper tag that allows you to come and go throughout the day without repeated violations of your personal space. And this little sticky badge, which I still had affixed to my chest, displayed the name of the government agency I worked for. What agency is that? The Department of Mental Health. Because I, despite my imposing physical appearance, am a lawyer, the regional legal director and deputy chief counsel for the State Office of Health and Human Services. Her eyes moved to the badge, and she froze, her expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. Then, without a word, she turned and quickly hurried down a side street, disappearing from view. It was at that moment that I said to my girlfriend, my voice laced with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement, "I think some lady just thought I was trying to kidnap her." So, to the downtown lady who I inadvertently terrified, I offer my sincerest apologies. I'm pretty sure you thought I was some heavy-breathing, perverted mental patient, rather than a government bureaucrat who was simply trying to do something nice for his girlfriend on his lunch break while vastly overestimating his own physical capabilities. Let's not meet again, because I'm afraid your heart might not be able to take it. And again, I'm truly sorry. The post office predicament. This story, while seemingly simple, carries a weight of fear and lingering questions that have stayed with me for years. I normally try to give my mother, Margaret, the benefit of the doubt, but as I've grown older, I find myself questioning her actions, or rather, her inaction on that particular day. Perhaps it's the hindsight of adulthood, the understanding of the potential dangers that lurked in the shadows of my childhood. I'd say I was around 8 years old at the time. Back then, we didn't have mail delivered directly to our house. We had to retrieve it from the post office in town. It was a routine task usually performed by my mother. But, as children often do, I developed a fascination with this seemingly mundane chore. I saw my mother retrieving the mail, and in my childish mind, I equated it with maturity, with responsibility. I wanted to be cool like my mom, so I began begging her to let me get the mail. I pestered her relentlessly, my persistence fueled by that youthful desire to prove my independence. Eventually, she relented. Now, to the actual story. I believe it was a weekend because the post office itself was closed. However, the lobby area, where the mailboxes were located, remained accessible. You could still retrieve your mail, but there were no postal workers present. I remember asking my mother if I could get the mail as we slowly pulled up outside the post office. She, without hesitation, handed me the keys, a jangling collection that included the key to our mailbox. I jumped out of our old van, my excitement bubbling over, and ran up the ramp leading to the building, skipping the stairs entirely. I opened the door and stepped into the quiet lobby. I saw a woman and a man retrieving their mail, their presence reassuringly normal. But then I noticed him, an older man, sitting in a corner, staring at me. Even as a child, I sensed something unsettling about him. He gave me weird vibes, as we'd say now, but still I did what I thought was polite. I gave him a quick smile and a wave. It was a mistake. The man smiled back, revealing stained, yellowed teeth. The smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a crooked, unsettling expression that sent a shiver down my spine. But I was focused on my mission, my desire to prove my maturity. I walked past him, heading towards the rows of mailboxes. I fumbled with the keys, my childish hands struggling to identify the correct one. The other people in the lobby finished retrieving their mail and left, leaving me alone with the staring man. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 to 5 minutes, I finally managed to unlock our mailbox. I was elated, a small victory in my quest for independence. I disregarded the man's continued gaze as I gathered the mail. With a quick click of the lock, I closed the mailbox and turned to leave. I could still feel the man's eyes on me, his unsettling smile lingering in my peripheral vision. It's a look that, even now, decades later, gives me chills. I put my open hand against the door, ready to push it open, when suddenly, a pair of arms reached around me. One hand forcefully pulled the door shut, preventing my escape. The other arm wrapped around my upper chest, near my collarbone, pulling me back into a tight, unwelcome and utterly terrifying hug. I froze. What was I supposed to do? I'd been taught to respect adults, to be polite. But this was anything but polite. This was terrifying. He smelled strongly of alcohol, a pungent, overwhelming odor that made me cough. He began to speak, his voice low and slurred, after a moment of simply holding me captive. The words he spoke were fragmented, disjointed, but the underlying tone was menacing, threatening. I only remember snippets of what he said. and I wish I could forget even those. "Hey, where are you going?" he asked, his voice almost passive-aggressive. "Oh, I have to go," I stammered, my voice trembling. "My mom is waiting for me." "Oh, okay. Okay," he said, sounding defeated. He began to loosen his grip, as if he were about to let me go. But then, before I could break free, he tightened his hold again, pulling me even closer. Wait, wait," he said. "I have a dog, you know." He had that same creepy grin, and it had only grown. "Oh, that's cool," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, desperately trying to conceal my growing fear. Yeah, you should come with me, and you can play with him." The scary thing is, for a fleeting moment I almost considered it. I was a child, easily swayed by the promise of playing with a dog. The next 8 minutes felt like an eternity. He kept repeating the cycle, loosening his grip, then tightening it again, preventing my escape. His scruffy beard and dirty coat brushed against me, adding to my discomfort and fear. The details are hazy, blurred by the passage of time and the trauma of the experience, but the underlying terror remains vivid. He kept telling me no, almost ordering me to go with him. Finally, he seemed to snap, his demeanor shifting from vaguely persuasive to overtly aggressive. "All right, you're coming with me," he declared, his voice firm, resolute. "What?" I exclaimed, my fear reaching a peak. "But I need my mom. I have her keys, and she's waiting for me. Please." My priorities, even in that moment of terror, were still focused on my mother, on the keys, on the mail. "Nope, you're coming with me now," he insisted. He opened the door and began to pull me outside. But in that moment, in a flicker of his weakened grip, I found my chance. I broke free, sprinting towards my mother's van, my heart pounding, my legs pumping. I slammed the car door shut, startling my brother and my mother. I started shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face, dropping the mail onto the car floor. My sister, Olivia, picked it up and handed everything to my mother, as she demanded to know what had happened. I told her everything, my voice choked with sobs, recounting the terrifying encounter. She looked furious, and I, for a moment, felt a surge of relief, believing she was on my side. I looked outside, tears still blurring my vision, and saw the man. He was looking at me through the car window, standing at the top of the ramp leading to the post office. I started to cry even harder, panicking, as he began to approach the van. My mother stopped me, and then she said something that, to this day, I struggle to understand. She claimed he was completely harmless. She said he had fallen at the bottom of the ramp, that he had tripped. She laughed at the man who had just terrified me, who had tried to abduct me. She started the car and drove away, attempting to comfort me with words that felt hollow and dismissive. "He was just a harmless old drunk guy," she said. "He didn't hurt you." Years later, I brought up the incident to my father, Daniel, when I was visiting his house. To my surprise, he had no knowledge of it. My mother had never told him. He was angry, understandably so, but I calmed him down, urging him not to confront my mother about it. He was furious that my mother hadn't intervened sooner, that she hadn't taken the situation more seriously. More recently, I brought it up with my mother again. Her response was even more disturbing. She accused me of being a drama queen, of exaggerating the situation. She insisted that I was never in any real danger, that the man had never tried anything. I was furious, but I held my tongue. Now, I'm left with a lingering sense of confusion and betrayal. I know his slurring was from drinking, but his tone was demanding, spiteful almost. My questions remain unanswered. What were his intentions? Was he truly harmless, as my mother claimed? Or was I, as a child, in far greater danger than she realized? And, perhaps most importantly, do I have the right to be angry, to feel betrayed by my mother's dismissive attitude? The uncertainty, the lack of closure, continues to haunt me. The chimes of Candlestick Cove. The sound woke me, a delicate, crystalline chime that seemed to drift on the night air. It was 2:47 a.m. According to the illuminated display of my bedside clock, I, Dr. Thomas Ashton, a recently retired professor of folklore, had moved to Candlestick Cove, Maine, seeking peace and quiet, a respite from the relentless pressures of academia. I had not expected this. I sat up in bed, listening intently. My wife, Beatrice, stirred beside me but didn't wake. She was a heavy sleeper. Bless her. The chimes continued, a gentle melodic ringing that seemed to come from outside. I got out of bed, my bare feet padding softly on the hardwood floor. I walked to the bedroom window, peering out into the darkness. My new home, a quaint, two-story cottage overlooking the rocky coastline, was shrouded in a thick, pre-dawn fog. The only visible light came from the moon, a pale sliver hanging low in the sky, and the distant, rhythmic flash of the Candlestick Point Lighthouse. I could see nothing in my yard. No movement, no source for the sound. I dismissed it as my imagination, perhaps the distant sound of buoy bells carried on the wind. I was, after all, a scholar of folklore, prone to flights of fancy, to seeing patterns and meaning where others saw only randomness. I returned to bed, pulling the covers up around me, trying to fall back asleep. But the chimes continued, persistent, insistent, refusing to be ignored, and they were getting louder. The next night, the chimes woke me again. 3:12 a.m. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was clear, distinct, metallic. Wind chimes. But I didn't own any wind chimes, and neither did my immediate neighbors. I had made a point of introducing myself to them when I moved in, taking note of their gardens, their houses, their lack of wind chimes. I got out of bed again, my heart pounding with a growing sense of unease. I walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The fog was thicker tonight, a dense, swirling blanket that obscured everything beyond a few feet. I could barely see the outline of my own backyard, let alone the neighboring properties. But the chimes were louder, closer, seemingly right outside my window. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the old oak tree. The oak tree at the edge of my property, a massive, ancient specimen that dominated the backyard. Its branches, gnarled and twisted, reached out like skeletal arms, disappearing into the fog. I hesitated. My rational mind told me it was just the wind, playing tricks on my ears. But a deeper, more primal instinct warned me that something was wrong. I pulled on a robe and slippers, grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table, and headed downstairs. The house was silent. The only sound, the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the increasingly insistent ringing of the chimes. Beatrice, thankfully, remained asleep. I unlocked the back door and stepped out into the night. The cold, damp air hit me like a physical blow. The fog swirled around me, thick and suffocating, limiting visibility to just a few feet. The scent of salt and seaweed hung heavy in the air. The chimes were louder now, clearer, a delicate, metallic melody that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. I walked towards the oak tree, my flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the fog. The sound grew stronger with each step, guiding me, pulling me forward. I reached the tree, its massive trunk looming before me like a dark, forbidding monolith. I shone my flashlight upwards, into the branches, searching for the source of the sound. And then I saw them, hanging from one of the lower branches, just barely visible through the swirling fog, was a set of wind chimes. But they weren't ordinary wind chimes. These were different. They were long and slender, made of a silvery metal that seemed to shimmer in the faint moonlight. There were at least a dozen of them, suspended from a circular wooden frame, and they were moving, swaying, clinking together, despite the complete absence of wind. I stared at them, mesmerized, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never seen chimes like these before. They were beautiful and terrifying. I took a step closer, reaching out to touch them. As my fingers brushed against the cold metal, I noticed something else. The chimes were covered in markings, strange, intricate symbols that I didn't recognize. They seemed to shift and change as the chimes moved, as if they were alive. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, seemingly carried on the wind, yet coming from the chimes themselves. Thomas, my name, spoken by a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien. A voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, from the heart of the ancient oak. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my flashlight falling from my grasp and clattering on the ground. The chimes continued to ring, their melody now louder, more insistent, almost demanding. I scrambled to retrieve my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I shone the beam back up at the chimes, my heart pounding in my chest. They were still there, still swaying, still ringing, their silvery surfaces gleaming in the light. The symbols on them seemed to pulse, to writhe, to breathe. And the whisper continued, more distinct now, more urgent. Thomas, listen. I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of my house, to the warmth of my bed. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by a mixture of fear and curiosity. The fog began to swirl faster, thicker, obscuring the chimes, the tree, the entire backyard. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The chimes continued to ring, their melody now a frantic, discordant cacophony that made my teeth ache. And then I saw it, a darkness, deeper than the fog, deeper than the night, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light, to swallow it whole. It was coalescing beneath the oak tree, spreading outwards, growing larger, taller, took on a shape, a form, tall, thin, with limbs that were too long, too slender, a head that was too small, perched atop a long, sinuous neck, and no face, just a blank, featureless void where a face should be. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was the source of the whispers, the source of the chimes, the source of the wrongness that had permeated my peaceful retirement. It was something ancient, something powerful, something evil. Took a step towards me, its movements slow and deliberate, yet somehow fluid, graceful. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but I was paralyzed, trapped by a fear so profound it stole my breath, my voice, my will. The figure raised its arm, its hand outstretched, its fingers long and skeletal, and then it spoke. Its voice was a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of lost souls, a symphony of despair. Thomas, you have been chosen. Chosen? For what? I didn't have time to ask. The figure lunged. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, falling heavily to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, its beam extinguished as it hit the earth. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs, my lungs burning. I had to get away, had to escape, but the figure was too fast. It glided across the ground, its movements silent and effortless, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. I turned and ran, blindly, through the fog, my only guide the faint, rhythmic flash of the Candlestick Point Lighthouse in the distance. I could hear the chimes behind me, growing fainter, but still present, still haunting. And I could hear the whisper, pursuing me, relentless in its pursuit. Thomas, you cannot escape. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until I could run no more. I collapsed on the rocky beach, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The fog was thinner here, closer to the water. I could see the waves crashing against the shore, the white foam illuminated by the moon. I looked back towards my house, towards the oak tree, but I could see nothing, just the dense, swirling fog. The chimes were gone. The whisper had faded. I was alone, for now. I knew I couldn't go back there. Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening, what that thing was, what it wanted. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the beach, shivering in the cold, waiting for the dawn. As the sun rose, casting its golden rays over the ocean, I made a decision. I would not be a victim. I would not be driven from my home. I would fight. I would use my knowledge, my research, my understanding of folklore and mythology, to uncover the truth, to find a way to defeat the creature that haunted my backyard. I would return to the oak tree. I would face the darkness, and I would, somehow, silence the chimes of Candlestick Cove. My retirement, it seemed, was over. My new quest had begun, and it was far more terrifying than anything I had ever encountered in the dusty pages of ancient texts. The chimes were a warning, and I had to heed it. I spent the day at the local library, researching the history of Candlestick Cove, delving into old records, newspaper archives, and local legends. I discovered that the area had a long and troubled past, a history steeped in tales of shipwrecks, unexplained disappearances, and strange occurrences. The oak tree in my backyard, I learned, was ancient, far older than the town itself. It was known locally as the Whispering Oak, and it was said to be cursed. According to local folklore, the tree was a focal point for something dark, something powerful, something that had been dormant for centuries, but was now awakening. The chimes, the legends said, were a warning, a harbinger of doom. I found several accounts of people who had heard the chimes, who had seen the figure who had vanished. Their stories were chillingly similar to my own, filled with descriptions of the fog, the darkness, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted. I also found references to a local Native American tribe, the Wampanoag, who had inhabited the area long before the arrival of European settlers. They had their own legends about the oak tree, about a spirit that dwelled within it, a spirit that demanded respect, that demanded sacrifice. The Wampanoag had performed rituals at the tree, offerings to appease the spirit, to keep it dormant. But the rituals had stopped centuries ago, when the tribe had been driven from their land. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the creature I had encountered was not just a figment of folklore. It was real, and it was connected to the oak tree, to the chimes, to the history of Candlestick Cove. I needed to find out more about the Wampanoag rituals, about the spirit that dwelled within the tree, about how to stop it. I spent the next few days tracking down descendants of the Wampanoag tribe, seeking their knowledge, their wisdom. It was a difficult task, met with suspicion and reluctance. But eventually, I found an elder, a woman named Sarah Redfeather, who agreed to speak with me. Sarah was old, her face etched with the wisdom of generations, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. She listened patiently as I told her my story, about the chimes, the figure, the darkness. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "The Whispering Oak," she said, her voice raspy with age. "It remembers. It always remembers." She told me the story of the spirit, a being of immense power, a guardian of the land that had been angered by the arrival of the settlers, by the disrespect shown to the sacred ground. The spirit had demanded sacrifice, blood, to appease its wrath. The Wampanoag had performed rituals, offerings to keep it contained, to keep it asleep. But the rituals had stopped, and now the spirit was awakening. "The chimes," Sarah said, "are a warning, a call. It is seeking a vessel, a body to inhabit, a way to return to the physical world." "And the figure?" I asked. "The one I saw?" Sarah's eyes darkened. "A shadow," she said, "a fragment of its power, a hunter. Can it be stopped?" I asked, my voice filled with a desperate hope. Sarah hesitated. "Perhaps," she said, "but it will require sacrifice." Sacrifice. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I knew what she meant. It wasn't about offering trinkets or flowers. It was about something far more substantial. "What kind of sacrifice?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "The spirit demands life," she said. "A life for a life." My blood ran cold. I understood now. The chimes, the whispers, the figure. It was all a prelude to something far more terrifying. The spirit wasn't just hunting. It was choosing. It was selecting its next victim. And I was on its list. "There is another way," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "A ritual. a Wampanoag ritual passed down through generations. It is dangerous, complex, and it may not work, but it is the only chance. She told me about the ritual, about the specific herbs, the chants, the symbols that were needed. It was a ritual of binding, of containment, designed to force the spirit back into its slumber, to seal it within the oak tree once more. But it required a catalyst, something to focus the energy to amplify the power of the ritual. The chimes, Sarah said, they are the key. They are connected to the spirit, to its power. You must use them, but be warned. They are also dangerous. They can corrupt. They can consume. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back to the oak tree. I had to retrieve the chimes. And I had to perform the ritual. It was a desperate gamble, a terrifying risk. But it was the only chance I had. The only chance to save myself, to save Candlestick Cove from the darkness that lurked within the Whispering Oak. That night, under the cover of a new moon, I returned to my home. The fog was thick, swirling, a suffocating blanket that muffled all sound. The chimes were ringing, louder than ever before, a frantic, discordant symphony of metallic sound that filled the night. I approached the oak tree, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling. I carried a bag containing the herbs Sarah had given me, a silver knife, and a copy of the ancient Wampanoag text. Its pages filled with strange symbols and forgotten words. The figure was there, waiting, standing beneath the oak tree, its form shrouded in shadow, its faceless void staring up at the chimes. It didn't move. It didn't speak. Just waited. I knew I couldn't confront it directly. Not yet. I had to focus on the chimes. I reached up, my hand trembling, and grasped one of the silver tubes. A jolt of energy, cold and powerful, shot through my arm. I gasped, recoiling, but I didn't let go. The chimes rang louder, their melody twisting, distorting, becoming a cacophony of pain and rage. The symbols on the tubes began to glow, a faint, bluish-white light that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. I felt a presence, a force, pressing against my mind, trying to enter, to control, to consume. I resisted, focusing all my will, all my strength on the ritual, on the words of the incantation. I began to chant, my voice shaky at first, then gaining strength as I repeated the ancient words, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange on my tongue, yet somehow profoundly right. As I chanted, I began to draw the symbols Sarah had shown me, tracing them in the air with the silver knife, the blade gleaming in the faint moonlight. The air around me crackled with energy, a tangible force that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The chimes rang louder, their sound reaching a fever pitch, a deafening shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The dark figure beneath the tree began to writhe, to twist, to convulse, as if in agony. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The fog swirled faster, thicker, obscuring everything except the chimes, the figure, and the faint, pulsing glow of the symbols I was drawing. I continued chanting, my voice rising above the chaos, the words of the incantation pouring from my lips, a desperate plea to the ancient spirits, to the forces of nature, to anything that could hear me. Then I felt it, connection, a surge of power, flowing through me, through the knife, through the symbols, into the chimes. The chimes began to glow brighter, their silvery surfaces radiating a blinding light. The symbols on them pulsed, throbbed, then exploded. A wave of energy, pure and white, erupted from the chimes, washing over the oak tree, over the dark figure, over the entire backyard. The figure screamed, a chorus of screams, a cacophony of agony and despair. Its form began to unravel, to dissolve, to break apart into swirling shadows, into fragments of darkness. The chimes shattered, their fragments falling to the ground like shards of glass. The fog dissipated, revealing the clear night sky, the moon shining brightly overhead. The silence returned, sudden and absolute. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted, drained, my body trembling uncontrollably. The figure was gone. The chimes were gone. The darkness was gone. I had done it. I had performed the ritual. I had banished the spirit. But as I looked at the oak tree, its branches now bare, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky, I knew it wasn't over. The tree remained. The history remained. The potential for darkness remained. I had won this battle, but the war was far from over. I would keep the silver knife and practice the chant. The fight was arduous, but worth it. The darkness would always be a threat, so I had to be ready.